pursuant to ARS subsection 38-431.02. Notice is hereby given to the members of the commission and to the general public that at this regular meeting, the commission may vote to go into executive session, which will not be open to the public, for legal advice and discussion with the city's attorneys, for legal advice on any item listed on the following agenda pursuant to ARS subsection 38-431.03 subsection A3. Item number 2 on our agenda is roll call, and I'll hand it over to Adriana to do that.
Kevin Bond.
Here.
Trauma. Eric Brownfield.
Here.
Tyler Denham.
Here.
Kevin Dobie.
Here.
Karen Flores.
Here.
Sandy Flores. Jackie Kellogg.
Here.
Devonna McLaughlin.
Here.
Moses Milazzo. Corey Runge.
Here.
Corey. Okay. Ross Schaefer. Glenn Slivers. I saw you, Glenn. Can you hear us? He's here.
Okay.
Amy Zaroya.
Here.
Y'all tricked me. Said you weren't coming.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you everyone for being here. Number 3 on our agenda is the land acknowledgement, and I will ask if I have any volunteers to read that. Commission members to volunteer to read it, I should clarify.
I'll read it.
Oh, thank you, Commissioner Kellogg.
The Housing Commission humbly acknowledges the ancestral homelands of the area's indigenous nations and original stewards. These lands, still inhabited by native descendants, border mountains sacred to indigenous peoples. We honor them, their legacies, their traditions, and their continued contributions. We celebrate their past, present, and future generations who will forever know this place as home.
Thank you so much. Item number 4 is public comments. At this time, any member of the public may address the commission on any subject within their jurisdiction that is not scheduled before the commission on that day. Due to open meeting laws, the commission cannot discuss or act on items presented during this portion of the agenda. To address the commission on an item that is on the agenda, please wait for the chair to call for public comment at the time the item is heard. Do we have anyone interested in public comment here or online?
Rumor has it we have one member of the public. I guess we don't have a comment for this.
No?
No.
Oh, I guess.
Oh.
Well, I guess for the cannot discuss, I did have one question where, say for,
So can I ask for you to introduce who, like, give us your name and?
I am Taylor Searchy. I live in Sunnyside. And I'm interested in housing and making it more affordable. I just had a question, I guess, an idea, and I wonder if it's just dead on arrival, or should I look into it more? Like, what if we had a municipal building supply resource depot? Say for lumber yard or brickyard or anything that would make housing supplies for building locally available and more affordable. Is that possible, or would that instantly be, say, illegal for some reason because it's competition with private?
So my understanding is we can't respond, but we can take the question under advisement and direct that towards staff to either get back to you directly or to educate us on those options on a future agenda. Yeah. Did I answer that correctly?
Yes. Can I get your contact information before you leave?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else with public comment? All right. It's weird. I'm making non-contact, I'm not sure. Okay. All right, item number 5 is approval of the minutes. So we have item number 5A, which is consideration and approval of the minutes for the Housing Commission meeting held on January 23rd, 2025. The action item would be to approve the minutes as presented or with any changes that anyone wants to recommend making. And I'll look for a motion from the commissioner.
I move to approve the meeting minutes from
January 23rd. Thank you.
I will second that.
Awesome. We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? All right, seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, hearing none and any abstentions? All right, awesome. Item number 5B is consideration and approval of the minutes from the Housing Commission meeting held on February 10th, 2025. The action item would be to approve the minutes as presented, and I'm happy to entertain a motion for that too.
I'd make a motion to approve the minutes from February 10th.
Awesome, thank you. We have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. A motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Any opposed? All right, that both of those action items pass. We're on to item number 6. 6A is the approval of rental incentive bond program awards. Staff is requesting the Housing Commission's recommendation of approval for 2 rental incentive bond program awards totaling $1,670,000, which will result in a total of 62 affordable rental units as recommended by the ranking committee. And I'll hand it over to Jennifer, to do a presentation on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Adriana, do you want to switch to the presentation or should I share my screen?
You know what? You could totally we could try to plug your computer in, is what I'm trying to say.
Oh, well, I'm in the Teams meeting, so it might be faster to just share when I try.
We can't see it on here
Oh,
in the room.
I see.
I know. New room, new issues.
Okay, so the plugin is.
Right here. Did I mess it up? Did I mess it up? No, I didn't mess it up. You're gonna have to come.
All right, my guess to keep this very fast because it's talk about today.
The other guy. Dan.
Oh,
I mean, that's the power you can.
You can see, you can see, you can see, you can think, you can think, you can think, you can think.
is my sound off?
Yes, you're gonna have to share the screen now.
I think it's already, can everybody see us? I'm plugged in, I think
For
physically.
online people.
No, we can't see it.
So I'm in the Teams meeting here.
So share and then.
Share. I'm sorry, guys, this is just too many options, but I think I have it like that.
We'll get so good at this in no time.
Okay, and then so I'm sharing presentation mode.
And then you can see.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. Hey everybody, I'm Jennifer Michelson, Housing Planning Manager. What we're here for today, what I need from the commission is to get your recommendation of approval for 2 rental incentive bond program awards. As Devonna introduced, and that's a total of $1,670,000 for projects resulting in a total of 62 affordable rental units. And this is all resulting from a notice of funding availability and a ranking committee scoring process.
Do you want people online to see your notes? You
You
might have to share your one.
I don't know if I have any, but where are they? I don't know how to make it not be like that. In presentation mode.
It's probably the swap screen functions if you right click.
You want to come to every one of our meetings?
They're probably seeing it in presenter mode. Are they not seeing this?
They're
They're
seeing.
seeing all of this.
Okay. Let me escape.
The icon at the bottom is a picture of a slide screen, the bottom right.
Okay. You're a pro. So now going to. No? It's still not. Okay, let me go into the Teams meeting itself.
You can maybe click present in Teams.
Oh, no. Now the speakers.
You guys, I don't know. I don't know which one I'm sharing where.
Okay. 1 second.
I'm
In
I'll stop.
Zoom, you have to start the slide first and then share the screen. I don't know how meetings works.
Here's my window.
Just leave it just like that. Just
Okay.
good.
We could just make it bigger though.
It's okay. I can see you.
Yeah, I don't really have any because it's so short. It's still not doing it. Okay. All right, so I just need the Housing Commission's recommendation of approval for these two separate rental incentive bond program awards. Really quick snapshot. This is like very similar to the process, or it's exactly the process that we followed last year, almost a year ago exactly, when we were awarding the initial $5 million amount. But just a really quick recap about how we got here. We have funding available because Prop 442 passed in 2022. That was our affordable housing bond. One of the categories identified in that bond was there were 4 total categories. One of them was to incentivize the private sector to incorporate affordable rental units, and $5 million was allocated for that effort. So we went to work developing the rental incentive bond program. That's a policy document. It was developed with the help of the housing commissioners in 2023. That was already a year and a half ago now. So we had commissioners' involvement with the development of that policy document. It was adopted by council in fall 2023. By the spring of 2024, we had our first round of NOFA, notice of funding availability for this money, and it was the whole $5 million pot was put out for award at that time, but only as a result of all the applications we received, $3.3 million was awarded. So clearly we had, $1.67 million remaining in that pot of money. And so here we are, on a annual cycle, I guess, we put that money out this winter for eligible projects to apply for that funding. So that NOFA process closed, I think mid-February, and we got to work with a couple of housing commissioners and a couple other city staff to review those applications we received. And so here is the result of that notice of funding availability. This is a chart with as much detail as I could get without it being too cramped. But we had a total of 3 eligible applications, and we only had enough money to fund 2 of the the 2 highest scoring applications did receive funding. So that's what's reflected here on this table. We have Elkwood Apartments, that developer was Wexford. They requested $528,000. They have a total project cost of about 83 million. They had a commitment of 10% affordable units. That was 22 units out of a total of 224 in their overall project. They agreed to serve a max of 70% AMI. That was a result of their DA, which was approved by council several years ago, actually. And they're just now at the stage where they're constructing. And so yeah, it worked out well for them to be applying for this funding. Out of 600 points, they got 516.
Jen. They can't see the sides changing.
Oh, okay.
You just have to click like where it says 3, 4, 5. You just have to click that and it'll make it bigger. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, is it sharing? Everybody can see it. Switch? Okay. All right, guys. All right. So, can you see the bottom? We need to get the bottom of this slide. Okay, it does
Yeah,
show.
And the other thing I think someone else was trying to say earlier is at the very bottom right, like where the tiny icons are. If you click that one that looks like a projector, I think it will present for you.
This one right here, slideshow.
Yeah, I think so.
I think I tried it. So it's showing it as presentation mode in the room, but online world is
Interesting.
only seeing this. I know.
Okay, well, we'll just keep going, no problem.
Can you present? I know this is a huge room. Can everybody see back there?
Okay, so, the great thing about the Elkwood application is that as a result of this, rental incentive bond program, they agreed to increase the amount of, their period of affordability from 30 years to 50 years. So that was really great. And that allowed them to receive the benefit of a forgivable loan. So the amount of money that they're asking for, this $528,000 will be forgiven at the end of that 50-year period. So the second, just moving on to the next, the highest scoring application after that was Atlantic Development with the Lake Mary Housing Project. They received 352 points out of 600, and they requested the whole pot. And their total project cost is looking to be about $107 million. They agreed, they committed to a 20% affordable housing contribution. So it's, double the number of affordable units at 40 with a slightly smaller size project there. So, and they're serving 80% AMI, which is required by our code. They agreed to this affordable housing commitment last year. It's been an ongoing project, very long-term kind of project in planning the last couple of years, but their rezoning was approved by council in December. So their development agreement included this commitment very recently, and it was approved by council. So they have not started construction. They committed to 30 years of affordability. And they're earlier in their process, in their development process, and that is why they didn't score as high as Elkwood. So they're much earlier. They're still putting together different options and packages for financing. But they are committed to that 40 units. And if you do the math, if you subtract, the whole pot is $1,670,000. If you subtract the first place application, that $500,000, the remaining balance can go to the Lake Mary Housing project. So they are getting $1,142,000. Where it is recommended that they receive that amount. So yeah, these are our two recommendations. What the process looks like from here is if the Housing Commission agrees with the ranking committee's recommendations, we would just take the same presentation to council and the same information on March 18th. We were scheduled to go. And council would provide like a head nod at that time. They're not approving the loan itself. We don't have that legal document worked out yet. But if council approves these award amounts, we would be noticing, we'd provide notice to the developers after that council meeting. So that sort of gets a confirmation for those developers that the award is coming, and we will then go work on their individual loan documents, which also need to be approved by council at a later date. So yeah, in the future, like if this all goes, we'll have some work to do getting those loans compiled and hopefully approved by council. And that's it. So yeah, at this time, I just need you guys to weigh in on if you would recommend that this award be approved. I don't know if any slides need to be reviewed or if you have any questions.
So do any commissioners have any questions for Jen on this topic? Anyone online have a question or comment? I'm wondering, Jen, about the fact that the second applicant applied for more than what they're being recommended for funding. Is the commitment of 40 units at 80% MI for 30 years still, they already are obligated to do that under their development agreement. So even though they're not getting the full amount, the community would still get what's promised in their application, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
And then can I ask, I don't know if it's before or after the vote, but I'm wondering if you can provide a status update on the first round of funds, where we're at on those development projects.
Sure, yeah, the first round of funding, a year ago, when we awarded the $3.3 million, it was awarded to a LIHTC developer, Foundation for Senior Living, or FSL. They have a two-phase low-income housing tax credit project in the works. It's been in the works for a long time, and they've had a lot of financing trials and tribulations. So they were awarded funding last year. No loan docs have been created or approved yet for those projects because they have not indicated that they are ready to start moving or constructing those projects. Yeah, like I said, it was a two-phase. It was a total of about 140 units total. Each phase was about 70 units. And they're just trying to advance each project forward as they can and as funding is feasible. So they had, if I remember right, I feel like they had funding secured for the first phase, and the second phase was a conditional approval of award, and they were provided 2 years to secure that funding. And actually, this LIHTC round on April 1st, their reservation of funds would expire actually after this LIHTC round if they are not successful in receiving LIHTC funding.
For the full 3.33 million?
I believe it was the second phase for Aspen Lofts. That project funding was more kind of tenuous. And they knew that they would be going back to apply for tax credit funding last year. They didn't, which they did, and they didn't receive that funding. And so we gave them another year this year to apply for that tax credit funding. And I think we have reason to believe they are going to try to apply for tax credits this year, but we have not been super involved yet. All I know is we have the funding, like the clock on that is kind of running out, and their reservation expires after this tax credit round.
So there is potential then that more money comes back in the pot.
Correct.
Within the next year. Like, it's not like they have like 5 years or,
Yeah, well, their reservation for that project was give or take $1.5 million. And if they, like, we're gonna have to understand, like, are they going to, we know that we'd have that money back in our pot and we need to put it out, and whoever applies for it that's fine. But they're gonna have to make a game plan if they're gonna go after that money again, if they're still trying to maintain that Aspen Lofts project and keep it rolling, or if they make another decision and that money would be available to any other eligible project that when we decide to release it. We just haven't gotten that far because we do not know that funding is going to be released or not.
So when will we know when is there a timeline? Like, the award is for a certain period of time, and then after that time period, like, is it one? I guess I'm just wondering, when do we as a commission get an update on if that money's coming back into the pot or if that development's moving forward?
After April, after this year's tax credit application deadline.
Well, it would be after the awards are announced in June, right?
Yes, there was another part because we weren't even really sure if they were going to apply. And so we would need confirmation that they did in fact apply for those tax credits. We don't have that confirmation right now. So in April, we'll know, yes, they did apply, or no, they didn't. If they didn't apply, I believe the funding is released and put back into the pot. But if they did apply and they're just waiting to hear to see if they got tax credit funding, then we would know that in June.
Okay.
So yeah, it's like a 2-part timeline that we can be checking in on that project. Yeah, it's just hard to anticipate if they've absolutely committed to applying, or if they're gonna forego that and think of something else. So worst case scenario, we will have, it'll be June before we know if we have more funding in the pot. So.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, is anyone interested in making a motion that is a commissioner, not just anyone, sorry. Be more clear.
I'll make a motion to approve these. This is Haley.
Okay, thank you, Commissioners Roya, and am I okay in assuming Commissioner Flores, you are good with a second? Sure. Okay, so we have a first and a second, motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor to recommend ward to council, please say aye.
Or did she state the
Approval.
motion?
The motion would be
I
if
think she
the,
actually stated what her
Oh, okay.
motion was. She
Sorry.
just said she was gonna make one.
are you talking about me or?
No,
I motion
I'm sorry.
to-
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so
Haley, go ahead,
Sorry.
Haley.
Okay, I'll motion to approve these and send them to council.
To
For
send to
approval.
council.
Okay, to send to council for approval. Okay, and then are you good with that second? Okay, all right, just want to make sure. All right, any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, any abstentions? Perfect, thank you so much. We'll move on then to item 7A, which are our presentation and discussion items. A is discussion. Staff is requesting feedback from the commission prior to drafting zoning code text amendments for missing middle housing types, which are further defined as duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhomes as required by House Bill 2721. This is a discussion item. And we're reconfiguring staff, but am I turning it over to Cindy? Sorry. Yes.
Just looking.
Yeah, you're ready for a little sugar. I'm coming back. If you're online, I'm sorry, you don't get a cookie. If you're here,
Well, you can go to your cabinet and get one.
well, then, yeah, if you have one at your house or workplace, wherever you might be. One
I
more.
do, could moment to grab it. Want to offer any cookies to the public?
Public who are here, yes. Public online, sorry. You're also at public.
Looks like it's trying.
How's it? Does it look okay?
Yeah, you're good.
Yay. How about when I move the slide? It's just
Yep, perfect.
beautiful. Okay, Tiffany Antal, zoning code manager. Hope to be quick today, but I'm looking for some feedback, direction on where to take the zoning code text amendment to address House Bill 2721 that is basically focused on middle housing. So before January 1st, 2026, we will need to adopt zoning regulations that allow duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and townhomes in any zoning district that allows for single-family residential. The bill further dictates that it's all lot zoned for single-family residential use within 1 mile of the municipality's central business district, and at least 20% of any new development of more than 10 contiguous acres. Right now, the issue is we don't officially have a designated central business district. So if we are to go this route, the first steps in the process will be going through that official designation first. We'll also need to determine areas that are likely to happen of new development, that'll be more than 10 contiguous acres, and start working with those individual property owners to see who would likely want to have this code amendment applied to them if this is the route we take. Really quickly, I do want to just cover what townhouse, duplex, triplex and fourplex is. Not sure what's happening. Okay. So just to cover really quickly, townhouse is what is listed in our zoning code as single family attached. Really, this is a dwelling unit that shares a common wall with another building, but it's on its own individual lot. So that's what makes it a townhouse, and that's what sets it apart from necessarily being a duplex or multifamily development. Townhouses do not share common floors and ceilings with other buildings. So because they are on their own piece of land, they're not airspace. They are something that happens through the subdivision process. A duplex is a residential building, and these are all pictures these are developments in Flagstaff. A residential building designed to be occupied by two families living independently of each other with two attached dwelling units on one lot or parcel. So really this becomes like either an owner lives in one unit and rents the other, or both units are rented independently. These units can be front to back, side to side. This is what I would call a side to side model. And they can be stacked. So one unit on the bottom floor, one unit on the top floor. A triplex and fourplex is really going to be the same as that duplex definition. So right now, our zoning code starts with single family, duplex, and then it goes to multifamily dwelling. So anything that is 3 units or more on the same parcel of land currently falls under the definition of multifamily. In order to comply with this, we will need to create new land uses for both triplex and fourplex. I went ahead and I gave you one particular drawing of a triplex. I haven't done a fourplex as of late, so anything I picked would have been really old architecture and maybe not as fairly represented with the other models. So this is one of the newer triplexes that was completed. This is both sort of a side to side, but also a stacked. So one unit is 2 stories. The other 2 units are both 1 story. In this case, the definition for triplex and fourplex would likely be the same, just switching out the 2 units with 3 units moving forward. So I wanted to have everybody to have that frame of reference when they're looking at these particular projects. I also wanted to call out in advance, what are the zoning districts that are currently allow for single family residential and those that would need to have this provision provided. So it's the rural residential, state residential, single family residential neighborhood, medium density, high density, community commercial, and neighborhood community commercial. So in these particular zoning categories, you can see what we already allow in terms of the missing middle. So for rural residential, for example, we already allow duplexes, we already allow townhomes, and we already allow multifamily residential. However, that multifamily residential is limited to the form of either a single unit or a duplex. So you could have multiple duplexes on the same property or multiple single family units on the same property. It does not allow multifamily in a form any larger than that single family or duplex. So it doesn't allow a triplex, it doesn't allow a fourplex, and it doesn't allow an apartment building, even though it would allow for multifamily residential. The same is true with single family residential. When you get to our single family residential neighborhood zone, which is a zoning district that's primarily applied to our historic neighborhoods in and around the downtown, that zone only allows for duplex and townhome. It does not allow for multifamily developments at all. So what's interesting about this juxtaposition is that when you get to what the allowed densities of each of these zoning districts are, you can see in the single family residential zone, it allows 6 units per acre. But in the single family residential neighborhood zone, it allows 14 units an acre. So a lot of the lots in the single family neighborhood zone can generally accommodate a duplex because they have the density that allows it. They could probably even accommodate multifamily residential, but because multifamily residential is not a permitted use in that zone, it's not something that they can produce. With this particular bill, we will need to go back in and allow now triplexes and fourplexes. So where you're most likely to see the development of those larger triplex and fourplex units would be in those areas where you're seeing the 14 units per acre. Just in terms of the lots that are already created, not thinking about new development areas, but just within the confines of existing subdivided Flagstaff. I would point out that medium density and high density, already allow for all of the missing middle housing types. So there's no need to change any of those code parameters there. In the community commercial zones, it's a little bit different. It's based on the size of the lot. We already have a lot of residential development in the community commercial zone. So for example, a big part of Sunnyside is in the community commercial zone, but the vast majority of those lots are already developed with residential. So provisions were built into the code that lots that were less than 9,000 square feet could have single family and duplex by right. Anything above multifamily would require conditional use permit. In this case, we would need to, again, add the triplex and fourplex, eliminate the conditional use permit in terms of those uses. And what was the other thing? That's the big thing. And so we would get rid of, but that would be specific to lots that are 9,000 square feet. Okay, so now you've got that quick introduction into the zoning, what those districts look like that might be impacted. The bill defines central business district as an area or series of areas. So it doesn't have to just be one area, it can be multiple. But it does specifically include the area we've officially designated as our downtown. So we don't have a CB, but we also don't have an officially designated downtown. There are lots of different maybe things we could pull from, like we have a downtown district, that kind of thing, but nothing really officially designated to pull from. The definition of central business district does not need to be limited to the downtown, like I said, and I went ahead and reached out to our economic development team because there's one other provision that also looks at having a central business district, and that has to do with the government property lease excise tax, or the GIPLET, which is a tax incentive that our economic development team uses. When I reached out to them and said, if we had to go through this process of creating a central business district, what would you recommend based on the parameters of this bill? And they said that they would likely push to see more areas included, and those areas they would suggest would be Aspen Sawmill, the Milton Corridor, the 4th Street Corridor, the mall, and the marketplace, as they sort of relate to that definition within this bill. So with all of that being said, I want to just give a perspective of what it would look like if we had a central business district. I grabbed our central business district zoning district, which is that area in red. It's pretty tiny. That's probably not a great representation of what would ultimately be the central business district, but I wanted to show you what everything gets grabbed within a mile. So you have Cherry Hill. It goes all the way up to McMillan Mesa. You have areas north of the hospital, you have Coconino Estates, you have Townsite, the historic downtown core, Southside, Plaza Vieja. So those are the neighborhoods that would fall within that 1 mile buffer. In addition, like I said, we would also need to look at those areas of new development. There was a new bill that had been introduced at the end of January to exclude historic areas because this particular bubble includes most of our historic districts. Unfortunately, that bill has died, so there will not be any. Right now, there are no additional provisions to address historic neighborhoods. So there are a couple of ways that we can tackle this. When things are limited, when a bill comes out and it limits provisions to very specific areas, it's really important to understand that the Arizona Revised Statutes requires that our zoning code be uniform throughout each zone district. So all zoning regulations shall be uniform for each class or kind of building or use of land throughout each zone. So it's not really possible for us to, within the same zoning district, say, if you're a mile from the central business district, you can have the triplex and the fourplex. But if you're 3 miles from the central business district, you can't. So within the same zoning district, you cannot do that. The tool that the legislative body gives us is the overlay zoning district, which allows us to sort of sandwich or layer zoning code amendments on our zoning code provisions on top of one another. So if we were to go this route, then you would likely see a zoning overlay. So here's a better, this is what a zoning overlay looks like. It's just another color on the map overlaid on a sort of partial area. So it's just another zoning district that sits on top. It floats, it creates standards in addition to what the base layer zoning is. With all that being said, that's the way that we would have, because the zoning districts cover a vast area of the city. And with the complication factors of overlays, so the more we add to the zoning code, the more layers we add on, the more complicated it gets, the harder it gets to express to individuals. More likely you could make a mistake too as well, because it's easy to sometimes overlook an overlay. What we're here to ask you today is how should the city move forward with this amendment? Should the city consider adopting the provision citywide? So rather than trying to target individual neighborhoods where triplexes and fourplexes, because that's really the bulk of what needs to change in the code. Should that be central or focused on these individual areas, or should we be going with the broad breadth of diversity of housing throughout all of the zoning categories? If, however, we don't want to move this citywide, if you have ideas of what would make sense for the downtown or what other areas you might want to see besides what we've listed. And then if you have ideas about what new development areas you would want to see included, that would also be really helpful. At this point, we've not drafted any part of the zoning code text. There's some complexities with this code, and we're trying to wait and see if something comes out in this legislative session that amends this bill. And so not to have to redo work before the deadline. We'll probably wait until after this legislative session is done to start drafting this particular code amendment. But with that, I'd love to open it up to a discussion and see what are your thoughts, what may be your concerns on how we go ahead and apply these standards.
Thanks, Tiffany. Any questions, comments, feedback?
So setbacks are the same? Setbacks would change or?
Yeah, this particular bill does not require any other modifications. So just because you list a triplex or a fourplex as a permitted use does not mean that the vast majority of lots will be able to accommodate them. So going back to that table, for example, single family residential, which is a good bulk of Flagstaff, you would need to have like more than half an acre lot in order to accomplish a fourplex. So the density doesn't change, the setbacks, the development standards don't change with this particular bill. Now, the next presentation that's coming up is going to talk about wanting to true up density standards. So start to see, it is kind of important to start to see the cascading impacts of things that are being proposed even in the next presentation. So if density were to change in the future as is proposed, then that would make those triplexes and fourplexes more easily developed in these zones with lower density allowances.
Unless you go up, right?
Unless you go up, but so no matter what, if you change density, you have to recalibrate all of those lot development standards. You automatically have to recalibrate lot coverage, setbacks, all of those good things. Building height generally would stay the same in all of those zones.
Would the same be true for like parking standards and that kind of stuff too?
So this particular bill does include provisions that each of the missing middle types discussed, duplex, townhomes, triplex, and fourplex, are only allowed to have, we're only allowed to require one parking space per unit. It weirdly does not include the single family home, so we can require more parking for the single family home, but we can't for the duplex townhome.
So that'll have to be an amendment to the code then to keep it in line with that.
Yes, I'm not going over all of the provisions of the bill. I was just keeping high level where we want to apply this in the future, but there are other provisions, there are other development standards we will have to apply to these missing middle.
Next, sorry, and Commissioner Dennis.
Yeah, I want to say I'm really excited for this. Allowing triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes is a great way to address our shortage of homes in a way that minimizes concerns about neighborhood character. And that we really need to pass a robust middle housing ordinance. Along that line, I have 3 suggestions. First, I suggest the ordinance be applied citywide instead of in a narrow zone around downtown. And I actually want to pause there and really thank you guys for making that an option. I think that shows just how dedicated Flagstaff is to making housing more affordable. I've listened into some of the conversations that other cities have had around this, and they're not being nearly as progressive as Flagstaff is. So I think the city deserves a lot of praise for that. My second suggestion is I think it would be neat to extend the ordinance to the development of cottage courts and courtyard buildings, which typically have like 6 units. I just think they're a nice form of housing that a lot of residents would appreciate having access to. And third, I prefer that the ordinance legalize missing middle housing through changes to the transect and the non-transect zones instead of through the creation of a new overlay. And I do actually, I did some homework here and I have a detailed list of steps for how to implement that avoids some of those nuances and concerns. And I'm obviously not an expert in this stuff. I'm just here as a community representative. So I expect some of this is incorrect or, is not taking something else into account. But I think it might be a neat starting point for a discussion. And I can go through that, but I'll pause there because I already gave a lot of feedback and open it up to other commissioners. Thank you.
So I did want to say I specifically left the transect out because I didn't want to make the conversation any more complicated than it already is. But the transect zone, just so you know, is really like a separate zoning code. It's an opt-in zoning code and it only applies to the downtown regulating area. So it's only a small portion of the city currently.
I want to basically agree with pretty much everything you said, Tyler, because I agree. I think it needs to be citywide, and I think this is a huge missing sector in housing. So I think it's important to to do that and not have the overlays and keep it simple.
Any other commissioners provide feedback, comments, questions?
And I'll check in. Is anyone interested in me going through that detailed list of steps? Or do we not want to have a conversation that technical in this format?
I know we've still got last cap and I'm worried about that a bit.
Sorry, I didn't have to
Yeah.
share, but I would like to, if maybe he could provide those steps and we could send them to our legal to make sure that they are appropriate for our.
Is it a way to like go over them broadly speaking and not get into every detail of them or?
It's pretty detailed. I'll send it, I'll have Adriana send it out after this meeting. And, obviously, like, this is just a starting point. I'm not an expert. I did a lot of homework here, but I know there's probably stuff that I get wrong. So just to have it be a starting point, can send it off to the other commissioners and obviously you can look over it too.
I guess I maybe, I don't know, can we have a chance to maybe review that and have a legal review on it before we send it to before we send it to the commissioners?
Oh, yeah.
Just to make sure that it does actually work with our, I don't want to confuse people by sending out a process that we actually can't do.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting.
Oh,
yeah,
no,
I
no.
just
I
wanna
mean,
make sure
that may very well be the case. And I do appreciate that level of review and checking of my work.
Thank you.
Any other comments? I just want to echo, I would agree that it should be implemented citywide.
Am I comfortable saying like the general feedback I'm getting from the Housing Commission is citywide? I would love it to say that. Yes. Yes. So I just want to know you're in agreement with the Heritage Preservation Commission, the Planning and Zoning Commission, and I've hit the Chamber of Commerce. So far, wide support to go citywide, which is really exciting. Yeah. I hope to take this to council to get their feedback next month as well. So another work session. And then
And if
we'll be
we're
on our way.
recommending citywide, then those next questions don't apply. Essentially, right? We don't have to figure out other commercial business districts and we don't have to, okay.
Yep.
That's a lot easier.
Just for the record, he agrees.
Oh, good. Thank you for letting us know, Commissioner Zuniga agrees. So before you leave, Tiffany, can I ask do I need to open it up to any public comment? Because I usually forget that. So okay, all right. So on this agenda topic, is there anyone from the public who would like to address the commission? So I'm looking at you, you're the one public person. So yes.
Again, Taylor Searchy from Sunnyside. I guess my own thing is I would like it to be citywide too. Seems simple and the stuff was needed. And so I think if you just did it in a few spots, wouldn't really help. You know, a lot of housing. So makes sense to do citywide.
Thank you for that feedback. I appreciate it. And then seeing another member of the public, can you say who you are and start first?
My name is Robert. I just want to say that I support what has just been said. I'm not going to add to it. Citywide.
Thank you. Anyone else who wants to give public comment on this agenda? Sorry, you're trying to get out of there. Oh, there is a hand. Okay. Who is it? Do we know? Online?
Is, Anne?
Oh, hi, Ann. If you want to tell us your last name and then are you a member of the public? And if so, would you like to provide public comment?
Yes, Anne Whitkey. I am a member of the public and I just wanted to contribute some public comment.
Excellent.
I posted a question in the chat. Is this multifamily housing? First, I think it's a great idea to have it citywide and even in the county if some people want it there. But I'm wondering if there's height limits to these multifamily buildings. Because, well, I do have solar panels on my house and I certainly wouldn't want tall buildings blocking the sun, for example.
Sure. Thanks so much for that question.
Yeah, Tiffany, can you answer them?
Sure. Each of the zoning districts already listed has a height limitation affiliated with it. The vast majority of these zones have a 35-foot height limit, even up through the medium density. The only zones that are higher are the community commercial and the high density residential, which are 60 feet. And the neighborhood community commercial, which is 45 feet. But we are looking at the possibilities of adding FAR to our residential zones, which will be discussed in the next presentation, which would also help keep buildings in size and character within their existing zoning districts and the parameters of those existing buildings as well.
And
What
nothing
is
with this
FAR?
changes.
FAR is floor area ratio. It's a different way of looking at lot coverage. It takes into account like the complete total square footage of a building, every story of the building, and not just the ground floor.
But this doesn't change the existing height limits. We were just listing what's there and what will be there.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
Awesome. Any other public comments? Thank you. All right, thanks, Tiffany. Thank you. We will move on then to agenda item 7B, which is last cap code concepts report follow-up, discussion and recommendations. And I'm turning that over to Michelle, right? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Michelle and friends. We got
Michelle and Fred.
another group project.
Michelle. We're gonna have like the traffic back here. It's okay. You guys can take it on the road.
It's good to be nimble.
I'm gonna open.
It's really toasty in here.
It is very toasty.
Well, they were doing something with the chillers at City Hall, so it's an ice bath in there. So I feel like,
Okay. Yes. Just wait them in the mission.
What is that noise? Let me get you set up, Michelle. This room is so picky.
Yeah, Adrian, is this your laptop? And it's the Teams meeting.
I mean,
And if we share.
Yeah.
It has to be a PowerPoint presentation, otherwise it doesn't show it on the TV, which is the weirdest thing I've ever seen.
For those online, we're working on technology to get the presentation going. Just as a-
is there an alternative? We could like, could we pull it up on one of our computers and look?
If you're at home, go find another cookie.
Second round of cookies.
I know, I think that's me.
It totally has. Yeah. There it is.
Awesome.
See if it'll go. Yes, I trust you.
Fortunes for the day. Yes, that'd be a fair.
Thanks for all my fortune.
There's a bus there.
Well, let me see if I can. Shoot this. Where's the house seat audio? Good, we can hear you. Okay.
Hey, you got it. Cool. All right, I'm gonna, hopefully everybody's back who's online. They got their cookie and are back at their station.
Good afternoon, everybody. Michelle McNulty, Planning Director for the City of Flagstaff. I want to start out by just thanking you for having us back. Thank you for all the time you gave us last commission meeting. We know we gave you a lot of information. This is a much more abbreviated presentation. We are going to hit on some of the points we talked about last time, but really at a high level, more as remember we talked about this. But please stop us and ask questions if you want us to go over that more, but we do not want to inundate you with that material.
Can I stop?
Yeah. Yeah, and I can't move it, the screen. Oh, that hit that.
Yes.
Okay.
It's always about the technology.
I was wondering if mine was weird because I was in the meeting. But
It doesn't bother
It
me.
works.
It doesn't bother anybody if it's up there. Maybe
Does
we-
this bother anybody? All these faces? No?
please press that line, like to minimize it.
Is that thing about it? Is it just? Okay.
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 Let's just go with it.
Let's just go with it.
Okay.
It's great.
Yeah, I think I figured out how to do the agenda or the slides. So, okay, so the agenda, we're going to kind of go over the housing and climate goals, just quickly the purpose of this process project and where we're at. And then we're going to go over the code concepts overview. And within that, we're going to go through those scenarios that we talked about last time and the key findings, and then the decision points. The ask that we have is as we go, it's really, we want to drill into those, having the conversation and getting the feedback on the different code concepts. So as we talk about the different scenarios, we're going to give you a little more information on that. We want you to ask as many questions and get your feedback about how you feel about how those scenarios perform. And it may be, I think one of the questions that we've heard from a lot of different groups is, do we have to pick one? You don't have to pick a scenario. We need that feedback on the scenarios to know, is it one of the three that we're presenting, or is there a fourth option? And so as we get that feedback, we can better understand if we need to kind of go back and build a Frankenstein model of a scenario. That's, here's what we like about scenario 2, here's what we like about 3, and let's create a new one. So that is really the conversation. You're not making any decisions today. You're giving us feedback. The same is true of those key findings and those decision points. This is a discussion, and then we will do the same thing with Sustainability Commission, and that's what we did last month. We went here in sustainability. We learned a lot by having these conversations. So what we want to do with this is get that information, and it's really going to inform how we start moving forward with the next round of presentations. Our goal is we are aiming to have a town hall with city council as well as members of this commission, probably Sustainability Commission, Planning and Zoning, different groups within the public in June. And so there will be an additional ask of this commission with plenty of time to get us the information and get ready for that June town hall. And likely one of those asks. Oh, okay. And likely one of those asks is going to be for this commission to identify, I think, 2 members that will go to that town hall to represent the commission. So just kind of, that's the overview of where we're headed. And if you can just kind of keep that in mind as we have the presentation of, maybe that will help you with the conversation. So any questions before I move on?
I have one. So I know you presented to us and to sustainability, but I think you were also going to council.
We did.
How did that go?
Thank you.
What happened?
So by the time we had done the presentation here in sustainability, we realized it was way too big. And so we pared it down. It's not the exact presentation you guys are getting today, but it's very similar, where we kept it a lot more high level and went through those decision points. Because it was so much information and because we really hadn't had the feedback yet from this commission or really sustainability, we really weren't able to share much about where we were going. So I don't want to say we're starting over, but we kind of gave them that presentation and basically said we were coming back. And so at this point, we'll be collecting all that information that we got at those first 2 meetings, After we went to city council, we did go to the Transportation Commission. Their real big conversation was really limited to parking. Our next round of presentation, Mountain Lion has been a partner of this. They had a grant through Metro Plan. I won't go into the details of all that, but part of looking at this is the transit. So the next round will be taking the feedback that we get from these presentations and adding the findings from the report that was done for transit. And then we'll be doing a similar outreach and then going back to council. So it's going to be very iterative. I think we've figured out that this is such a big conversation. It has to be kind of broken out into smaller chunks and just refine it and kind of being more iterative.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Iterative, that's never an easy word for me to say. So, we talked about, we were doing this big code analysis project through the lens of the housing and climate goals. So we really wanted to identify what are these goals that we're looking at. And so for the 10-year housing plan, the big policy is that it aims to reduce the affordable housing need in our community by half over the next 10 years through two elements. And this is where, I can read it on here. Impact of at least 6,000 low to moderate income Flagstaff residents through a combination of unit creation or subsidy provision. And then the second implementation strategy of being create or preserve 7,976 housing units by 2031, with a minimum of 10% of them being affordable. This will increase the overall supply of market rate, workforce, and affordable housing occupied by local residents. The other carbon neutrality goals that we're looking at this project to achieve is achieving carbon neutrality by 2030 through a 44% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and prepare Flagstaff's communities, systems, and resources to be more resilient to climate change impacts. And thirdly, address climate changes in a manner that prioritizes those most impacted and ensure the costs and benefits of climate adaptation and mitigation are equitably distributed. So those are the 5 kind of guiding principles of what as we're looking at these codes and these scenarios that we're really trying to achieve. Just a quick reminder, we've already done the land use, land availability suitability study. We've done the first phase of the code analysis project, which was looking at all those development codes to identify the barriers to achieving those goals. And then where we are, we've, with the code analysis project, are these code concepts to address those highest barriers. And then we will be back and we'll talk about next steps again, but I think I always warn you guys, you're going to see us again and again and again. So this is a pretty big project. Just quickly, these were the different major code barriers that were identified in that code diagnostic. What's being covered right now by that panel is winter parking ordinance and transportation demand management for traffic impact analysis. Okay, so we are at the code concepts report. So we did this report was done doing several things. We did impact modeling, so creating prototypes. This tests both the revenue impacts of potential code changes and the cost of impacts of code changes, in addition to options to reduce those costs. So we want to be mindful that we're balancing these goals, right? We want to address carbon neutrality, but we also want to maintain reasonable housing cost. Doing spatial analysis to test the impact of the code concepts on the capacity for new housing in certain locations across the city for the purpose of reducing transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions. So really, when you have reducing that vehicle mile traveled and getting density in areas that are closer to employment centers, shopping, retail opportunities, and then also best practice research. Really looking at our sustainability and housing standards and incentives, our resource protective overlay, and reduced street widths, winter parking ordinance, and snow removal. And so again, I talked about those code concepts. We've talked about the scenarios. So the purpose of this phase of the project is to develop conceptual alternatives for code updates that address some of the most significant barriers identified in the code diagnostic report. And we really want to help explain that these two sections inform each other. So the scenarios inform the code concepts, and the code concepts inform the scenarios, but they're kind of two different asks. So when I say that, if everybody says, we love scenario 3 that is increasing density, and by that, then we kind of indirectly support sustainability. But then we talk about code concepts such as increasing density in every zoning district, and people start saying, no, we don't want that. We have a fundamental issue. And so if you start to tell us you're kind of happy to go up maybe 5% rather than 10%, I'm just throwing out numbers to explain the concept, with density in certain zoning districts, then that tells us kind of where that starts to help us calibrate those scenarios. And that's why I say we need this feedback to understand what kind of scenario where is this community really willing to go, so that when we start to do the text amendments to change code, that everybody's on board with us and coming along, and that we're not saying we want these things, but then in practice we really don't. So we really want to help the community along the whole way. And so we're going to go over the code concepts. We're going to get into a pretty lengthy conversation about these, so I don't think I need to talk about these. I want to make sure, Jenny and Jen, that you're going to go into detail on these. Or should
Now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we really want to talk about for a menu of sustainability and transportation demand management standards. Do we want to go on a menu or points-based approach of standards and incentives that developers can choose from, or foster a higher level of sustainable design in all projects? So that might mean that it's not a code that says you shall do X, Y, and Z. It's a code that says, here are different things you can do, and it kind of gives the developer the opportunity to decide what works for their development. But then there are different points associated with that. So say you have to meet a threshold of 10 points, then it's kind of like weighted value. If we're really trying to get connected subdivisions, then we may put higher points on if you have different connection points and a highly connective design subdivision, versus other things that kind of get us there, but you might need more menu choices because they have lower points. So that's what we mean by a menu or points-based approach. Traffic demand management is a critical component. This is really changing people's behavior and how they use their cars. So carpooling, transit-oriented design, that's really putting your density near high transit, served locations, bicycle facilities, transit passes, site design, etc. Resource protection overlay, and this is to migrate from a broad overlay zone that requires site-specific inventories to a more focused overlay that focuses on resources that were inventoried as part of a citywide study. And this could apply to both forest and slope resources, but we're also looking at some other innovative ways to move forward with that. I don't want to get too much into that, but I will tell you that we will probably be back with soon with an idea that we've come up with that I think could be really beneficial to our community now and as we move forward with this project.
That's a fair question.
Yes.
So I think our feedback is great with all of this, but is anyone asking the developers and the builders what they foresee as their biggest challenges, restrictions, costs associated with these types of things? Because I think their feedback is super important.
So the answer is not yet at this stage. So when we did the code barriers, they were one of the few groups that we actually interviewed. We did not really reach out to community groups. We met with the developers, designers, landowners, and even some of the organizations that do financial lending to commercial development. And that's where they helped us. I really identified what those big barriers were. So that then now what we're trying to do is gauge where's the community at. So then we can start bringing in the development community and having that conversation of here's the barriers from your perspective, and here's kind of where the community is at. So how do we work together to move forward? But they will be part of it. that's a really long answer. They will be part of this, but we're also trying to understand where our community is at as well. Does that help?
It does, so, but we're going through this, I mean, is this all the things that you share with us, is it based already on their feedback?
It is, because really so thank you. And so when we did that diagnostic and the barriers, in addition to all the review that was done just from a technical review standpoint, the developers gave us a lot of impact on what are the big barriers that they see. And quite frankly, a lot of the code concepts that we're bringing to you are things that we've anecdotally already heard from the development community. Like we hear they are not shy about sharing with us what works and what does not work in our code. And so we've used a lot of that information, and there was a lot in those interviews that happened that gave us a lot of information that's informing this code concepts. Yeah.
And we have questions later we're gonna get to, which is the priority for our discussion today, for our meeting today. We do have a question about what you all think about a menu of sustainability options.
Yeah.
What to do about parking reduction, yeah. So these next couple slides she's
Yeah.
reviewing, we will discuss as like an actual question we're
Yeah.
getting to, so.
Well, and I mean, that's helpful because I don't want to be saying, I think this is a great idea, when a developer would say, oh, that's stupid, why I don't like that idea.
Yeah.
So then I feel like we're going backwards.
Yeah. And, part of it is I think they're giving us the feedback. One, a lot of the feedback we have from them are what they know from their buyers, but also from their costs. And then, so this is kind of more of that qualitative, this is as a community, how we want to grow and still protect our community character. And then there's that dialogue of meeting in the middle. But I suspect a lot of these are kind of in the direction, we get a lot of feedback from them. We've met with like even the chamber and different groups. And this is, I think, in line with where they're all wanting us to head as well. I think where that conversation gets really detailed is when we start to put those code, the code language together and start moving that, because then they start to understand, they can look at that and apply it to a development and really understand what those impacts would be. And then we can start having those conversations as well. Thank you. Hence why you're going to see so much of us. This is great. And then just the last thing on the resource protection overlay, that, really the resource protection standards should not restrict density more than the base zoning. And they should allow for overlapping slope and forest resources to count towards meeting both requirements. And one of the things that was really identified in the code, the diagnostic, and that first thing we were talking about, the barriers, is right now this resource protection overlay is impacting density of the base underlying zoning. So I think I can't remember, Tiffany, do you remember the exact numbers of where we were falling short? But I mean, RPO.
Where we're falling short?
Yeah, how it's actually impacting us from being able to meet our minimum densities.
So RPO, well, it's a combination of RPO and our road layout designs. For example, the R1 zone, we were talking about a 6 acre minimum, or a 6 acre or 6 unit per acre maximum. In subdivisions, the highest we're generally able to achieve with all of these layers of requirements is about 4.
Yeah. And that's why that specific ordinance is such a big part of this conversation. Okay. The other code concepts we're going to talk a lot about are the reduced street widths. So the report really came out with new options for more narrow street designs that would allow slightly higher density and reduce street construction cost, as well as calm traffic speed. So that has a lot of benefit when you start to reduce the width of those. And then the winter parking ordinance and snow removal. So we're looking at different ways. So currently, we have developers design a street that is fairly wide to accommodate not just 2 lanes of travel, but then also parking on each side. And theoretically, we should say, well, we're doing that, so why do people have to provide parking on their site? Because they're already paying for these roads that are supposed to accommodate the parking. But we have about 6 months out of the year where you can't park on the streets because of snow clearing. And so then where are the cars, if you can't park on the street, where are they going to go if you're not providing parking on site? So we really need to, as a community, kind of grapple with that. Are we willing to maybe talk about not having streets cleared as quickly. And so we can do some type of alternative, like maybe you clear one side of the street and not the other. And then again, that helps us then start to talk about reducing those street widths. So that's a big part of some of the concepts that we're going to be talking about later. And so I'm going to turn this over to Genevieve, but again, those were just high level overview of those code concepts, and we're going to go into a much deeper dive.
Yay. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Genevieve, Pair 3 in the Sustainability Office. I was here last time, so thanks again for having us here another time. So Michelle talked about the 4 code concepts. I'm going to talk about the other major section of the report, which is the scenarios. And just to reiterate what Michelle said, it really is a puzzle piece. All these things fit together. Changes that we make about development on private property relates also to things we do in our right of way, in terms of street design. All of those things impact how many units can be built, what type of units, how much land it can be used for units versus parking versus resources versus street width. And so it really all fits together. And that's why we're talking about all those things together. So you'll probably remember we talked about some scenarios last time, and I want to reiterate, though, that really the idea is to pull from different scenarios to find, again, the Frankenstein scenario. Maybe that's not the most positive word, but basically, like, how can we best meet our climate and housing goals? These kind of go all in one direction. So they're kind of the extreme. So they're not really, so that's why the idea is that what can we learn from each of them to actually pull them together into one scenario. So the first one is it just looked at optimizing the incentives for sustainable building and affordable housing. So that's all it did. And basically what happens if we do that? How does that impact our housing climate goals? The second scenario looks at elevating sustainable design as well as increasing market rate housing. And in that one, and I'll talk about these in a little more detail, but that one focused on base code changes as well as some more minor changes to the incentives. And then scenario 3 is really similar to scenario 2, except without the sustainable design standards. And so really the thought is that the direction that City Council provides on the code concepts as well as the scenarios will come together into some combination of all of the things we've been talking about. So that's why we're kind of trying to focus on outcomes. Oh, where'd there we go. Okay, so we did talk about this last time. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly so we make sure we get to our discussion, but please stop me if you have any questions. As I mentioned previously, this is just the base code, so I won't talk about that too much, just for reference. That's what we have right now in our current code. So again, scenario 1 focuses on how do we make the incentives more financially appealing. So it increases density, the density bonus a lot, and the minimum parking that projects that take either the affordable housing or the sustainable residential building incentives get. So basically no increase in base code. Let's just sweeten the pot for incentives. Let's see what happens with housing and sustainability outcomes. Moving on to scenario 2. So this one increases the base code, the density in the base code by quite a bit. It also reduces minimum parking requirements by quite a bit in the base code. It allows single-use residential buildings to be in commercial zones, so that's not currently allowed right now. It also introduces FAR, or floor area ratio caps. Tiffany mentioned that. I will talk about that a little bit more just to have some visuals on what that looks like, and then applies new sustainability standards to all projects. It also has some changes to the incentives for projects that provide elevated sustainable design. They get minor increases in density as well as pretty big reduction in parking. So basically, if we did all these, the consultant was like, what would happen in terms of meeting our climate and housing outcomes? And the last scenario is scenario 3. So that one I mentioned is pretty similar to scenario 2. Very similar density increases, slightly higher in commercial zones. Same parking reductions, also allows single-use residential in commercial zones. Doesn't change the incentives, the kind of what people have to do to get the incentives, but again, it makes them more financially appealing with higher density and lower parking. So anyway, so those are kind of, extremes in different directions, and kind of just seeing like if we tweak these levers and calibrate these parts of the codes,
code, what happens? Okay, and so basically these are kind of the things that I'm just going to talk about some of the technical components that were tweaked in each of these scenarios. So the first one was density. So again, you saw this last time. I won't go into it in too much detail. This is our current density right now. And so B is by right development, so anything not taking the incentives. S are projects that take the sustainable incentives. A are projects that take the affordable housing incentives. So what's the density for those different scenarios? Again, this is our current density. So we can see in scenario 1, density increases under these S and A columns. So they get projects that take those incentives get more density. By right, projects that don't take those incentives, no additional density. Scenario 2 and 3 increase density for the base code. So projects that don't take incentives, as well as for projects that do take incentives. And again, the density increases are very similar, except for a slightly higher in the commercial zone for scenario 3. But again, that could have been applied to 2 also. So that's the thing, we can mix and match these different components to best meet our housing goals in terms of where we go from here for actual code recommendations. And then this is looking at density bonuses. So again, that's just for projects that take the sustainable and affordable housing incentives. So we can see they get the largest density bonuses for scenario 1, so it had the largest increases, but also some increases for scenario 2 and 3 in terms of how much density projects could get if they take those incentives. So floor area ratio, this is a really helpful visual. Tiffany mentioned it's another way of looking at lot coverage. So density regulates the number of units on a piece of land. Floor area ratio helps regulate the intensity. So what do those units look like? How big are they? So lot coverage. So all of these have the floor area ratio of 1. So basically the square footage of the building is the same area as the lot, but it looks very different, right? So on this one, we have just 1 story. It's covering the entire lot. That's a pretty big building with probably just 1 unit. So this one, which is 50% lot coverage, but still 1 FAR is 2 units. So same floor area as this building, but now there's 2 units. And then that one has the same floor area as these 2, but there's 4 units. So it's a way to have the same building square footage, but potentially get more units. So it's a really interesting tool. We actually have it right now in our commercial zone. So we can see right here. So it's a cap. So basically there's a floor area cap. So that limits the floor area in those commercial zones. So that's our current code. In scenario 2, the consultant, they just put it in scenario 2 because I wanted to see what would happen. But again, it could go in any of the scenarios, but basically want to see if we put a cap, what happens. And so if we put these caps in these zones, does it, lead to more units, maybe smaller units if you have the same floor area ratio? You could have 1 big building, or you could have 2 or 1 big unit or 2 smaller units that are the same size as that 1 big unit. So it's basically a tool to potentially get smaller units.
I actually have a question about FAR, and should I ask it now while we're on this section or wait to the end?
Go for it.
Okay. I actually think FAR is really interesting. There are other places that use it in interesting ways, like Japan. But the primary motivation for trying to apply FAR is to get smaller units, right?
It can.
It can be.
To get smaller.
Okay.
It also reduces the intensity of density because you're kind of.
Reduces the building
Mm-hmm.
envelope. Yeah, that part actually confused me a little bit as a way to reduce the size of individual units because, again, I'm not a developer or anything, but I have a heuristic I rely on for how developers act. In general, they want to minimize the land, they want to maximize the building envelope, and they want to maximize the number of units. So they're already highly motivated to, stuff the building with small units. In this case, we're saying that we're having trouble getting them to build those small units. And the only way I could figure that would be true is if there's a mismatch between our intensity limits and our building envelope limits. Like basically we allow a building envelope that would fit easily 8 units, but because we don't allow an intensity of 8 units, like instead we only allow 5, you get 5 really big units. Is that true? Am I understanding?
So let me help break it up a little bit like this. density, right? So the
Yeah.
number of units you can have per acre. You have to remember that a 1 bedroom or a studio unit is the same as a 5 or a 6 bedroom unit. So when we calculate density, if you say you have 6 units an acre, 6 1 bedroom units are very much different in their intensity of what will be felt or expressed in that development than a 6 unit, 6 bedroom development, right?
Yeah, because
So
units
that's
are.
right. So when you only have lot coverage in residential and it sets as building footprint, and you don't take into account the height or every story of the building,
Mhm.
it gives greater opportunity to increase the size of each unit. So overall, even in terms of high occupancy housing, which we don't have to dig into the depths of it, but when we had concern about high occupancy projects, it's not always the number of total units, it's the number of total people living in the building all at once. And so the idea with FAR, and I would remind that no tool is perfect and no tool will ever get the exact replicas of everything we want. But FAR is an additional tool that can be applied in such a way, if calibrated correctly, can get buildings that are more congruous with one another in areas. So it's funny because we always look at pictures of development and everybody loves multifamily development. That's 1 and 2 stories. What people don't love and don't pull out are the 5, 6 big buildings and say, this is what I want to see in my neighborhood. And so, FAR is one of those things that can help address that sort of character, but also still allow for that diversity of housing.
Mhm. So then if I can restate, our code allows for a larger building envelope. Our code allows for a certain building envelope. And developers would want to put a lot of small units in that, and maybe that building envelope would match that number of units or number of bedrooms. But then we have these bedroom per acre limits and these unit per acre limits that are much lower than that. So instead, they're basically building a building for 8 units, but they can't put 8 units. So instead, they put 5 large units. Is that central point correct?
Yes.
Okay. That's tough for me because, I think we might also just want to make sure that those measures are more in line with each other, that the building envelope, and maybe this is a way to do that. Another question, if we try to impose FAR, does that open us up to Prop 207?
So the strategy here is that the only way to add additional standards that we will be successful is to offset it with additional density, reduction in parking, some offset.
Mhm.
So that is the whole point of these scenarios, is to offer a strategy,
Mhm.
a set of offsets for a set of new requirements.
Yeah, stick the pill in a piece of ham when you give it to your dog.
If you understand what Prop 207 is. So Prop 207 is a waiver. So the state, I think that went into effect in 2007. And essentially, if a jurisdiction adds codes or standards that are seen as devaluing the property, we have 3 years from when that code went into effect to file a Prop 207 waiver. And then it's on the city to prove that the new code has not devalued that property. So if you one day were able to get 4 units on your property and we passed an ordinance that said tomorrow you can only have 3, we've devalued that property. So when we talk about putting the ham on the pill, we need to give enough value back. So maybe you can't, your coverage can no longer be 50%, it needs to be 25%. But we're giving you the ability to have 2 or 3 additional units in your density. Then you start to offset any cost impact. And that's what we're really talking about, is offsetting, and so that we're kind of having a net zero impact on development, so that we aren't getting those claims. Otherwise, we're going to have Swiss cheese zoning, and it's just going to be, everybody's going to pull these little waivers and we won't have a consistent pattern and really move the needle where we need to go.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, and in this case, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, my substantive complaint about FAR isn't really about FAR itself, but that we already have a lot of different ways in which we regulate the building envelope. Like, gone through and tried to catalog with my own CAD software, all the different ways in which we regulate the building envelope. It's a very thick stack here. And we also have all these different ways that we regulate intensity. And a lot of these are redundant to each other. Like FAR is somewhat redundant to setbacks, lot coverage, and height, because those are both defining a certain building envelope. And in the places that do seem to use FAR successfully, they seem to have much simpler codes. And I'll go back to that Japan example because FAR is like the primary way that they regulate building envelopes. They only regulate development, the building envelope with 4 rules. They have a setback, they have a height. The height calculation is somewhat complex depending on the width of the street, but it's essentially a height. They have a FAR, and they also regulate like the land use. They have different zones for different land uses. So if we were going to implement FAR, I would consider trying to simplify the set of rules in which we're using as you do that trade out.
Thank you.
Thanks. And we do have a question about FAR at the end. So if other folks have comments as well, like you'll be able to jump in. But I'm going to keep going. So just one other thing that was tweaked across the scenarios, and thank you, Tiffany and Michelle, for reiterating it, that the idea is that if there are additional standards, they're offset by a lot of additional economic benefits as well. So there's kind of a lot of giving and taking in each of these scenarios. But this just looks at, for example, what they were tweaking, what the consultant was tweaking with parking. So in the incentives in scenario 1 was looking at providing 0.75 parking spaces per unit plus some guest parking. So an example of a 20-unit multifamily development would have 20 parking spaces. For scenarios 3, they looked at what would happen if we required 1.25 parking spaces per unit plus some guest parking, and then that would be 30 spaces that are required. And again, these are not set in stone. It's just the consultant was like, what would happen if we did this? So just kind of some things to think about moving forward in terms of parking. And this is the last thing that was tweaked across those 3 scenarios. So this table compares the existing code with scenarios 1, 2, and 3. So we do have some sustainability incentives right now in the existing code, and folks do get a density bonus for taking those. So in scenario 1, kept those incentives the same, just made the sweeten the pot a lot by having reduced parking, increased density. Scenario 2, it looked at updating the base code to have that menu of options that Michelle mentioned earlier in the presentation. Also additional incentives for elevated design. And then also it looked at the affordability incentives, just increasing density a little bit and reducing parking a lot. But the biggest change is in that buy rate code for scenario 2, having that menu of sustainability standards there. And then scenario 3 just goes back to having incentives for elevated sustainable design, no changes to the base code or the affordable housing incentives there. Okay, I think passing it on to Jen. So thanks everyone for hanging in there. This is quite a bit of information.
Oh, yeah, I have the fun part of just reviewing the implications and the key findings of the code concepts report. It was really, really enlightening to have the consultant literally list them. And so we're kind of reiterating them here for everybody as like really key takeaways. So yeah, what the scenarios are telling us is that under scenario 1, we have the ability to get the affordable units and the sustainable features that we want by increasing the attractiveness of the incentives. And leaving the other code requirements as is. It's like a very simplistic approach. With scenario 2, if we package sustainability standards with increased density and parking reductions, we can see a big increase in housing production, which is a great goal for both of our plans. But we need to be careful that we're not giving away too much, so much density and parking reduction that our affordable housing incentives are no longer attractive or effective. So that's a balance we need to be incorporating into our process going forward. And yeah, an implication for scenario 3 is just like, again, we're using increased density and parking reductions to achieve the maximum housing production. So we see the biggest number of housing units under scenario 3, but we are not seeing any enhanced sustainability requirements there. They've just kind of dropped off. And any improvements or achievements we are seeing toward carbon neutrality are more of like an indirect through just more compact design and more density concentrated in areas. So like people might be driving less. So anyway, so the next set of key findings and implications are that we have 5. Yes, we have 5. And the report is telling us that 1, it's expensive to develop in Flagstaff. I think nobody would argue. That's that. Moving on across all scenarios, we're really seeing parking reductions are critical to the market feasibility of higher density housing. Just finding more of a balance. If we're asking for more units, like the land can't be, so much land can't be eaten up with our same amount of parking requirements. So reductions are looking more and more necessary. It's just a question of the extent to like how much parking reduction. So number 3, if the city desires to concentrate density in areas where households are likely to be driving less, then targeted rezoning or an overlay zone, other code regulations that are like proximity based to those more walkable or less driving intensive areas, then that would be an effective way to go about those increased density requirements rather than just doing a broad increased housing density across any zone, no matter where you are. So they are, in a sense, recommending that we sort of target our density in certain ways. The 4th goal or the 4th implication is that if our goal is to broadly increase density throughout our community, then we're going to need to update our core development standards to get us there. So all the code core standards that everybody was talking about, like all the FAR, the parking, the density, those need to be manipulated and refined in order to achieve greater housing outcomes.
And if I can, and the reason for that is because the incentives typically really come into play when someone is rezoning their property. If they can do something by right, there's a lot less likelihood that they're going to use those incentives. They still have the option to, but where we really see them being effective is in the rezone process. And that also the rezone process can be challenging and take longer because then there's a lot of negotiation. So then people will then sometimes defer to their underlying zoning, which for us, the largest land holdings that we have that are going to be redeveloped are in our lowest density, that are our rural residential or we are estate residential zoning holdings. That's why that diagnostic report was so important to this to help us see those connections. So if you just make it part of the zoning code, then you don't rely on that negotiation process, and it's just you're developing, and then you're up to these standards that provide for that more, allowing for that higher density. So, sorry.
No, that's great.
Yeah, clarify that.
Yeah, and the final implication I just want to review is that like any increase in housing production under scenario 1, that the first where we're prioritizing incentives over any other base code requirements, being able to see any positive impact on our housing production units, it's super duper dependent on developers choosing to use those density bonuses under scenario 1. So yeah, we couldn't it's not really a guarantee or a given that we would in fact see people using those density bonuses because it's not a by right requirement. So next slide, I'm trying to get us closer to our questions, but this slide is new, this table. We put some effort into kind of rethinking how do we focus more on outcomes rather than picking a scenario, of course. So we just wanted to, in a very brief, simple way, provide like a visual. This is like an update to our stoplight analysis. I believe our first presentation had it, I think. But this is really just a synthesis of how each scenario supports the outcomes that we called for in our 10-year housing plan and our carbon neutrality plans. It's just a simplified version of the anticipated outcomes that we're likely to see in each scenario, and the outcomes, those kind of more detailed tables. If you guys reviewed your memo, we have those kind of more detailed tables listing out each outcome we hope to achieve in each of our planning documents. So we can pull those up. We have those tables here at the end of our slide if it helps us in our discussion later. But this is just a simplified take on that. And then we're getting these, this is just a really interesting slide because it's really just telling us in each scenario how many housing units can be realized. It's really cool that the developers or the consultants were able to identify, like land on an actual number of anticipated. This is kind of built on tons of assumptions, but it just gave us an understanding of what's possible citywide if we were to proceed down any particular path. So you can see that scenario 3 results in the highest number of units in general. And the other two aren't like insanely far behind, but you can just tell that that's where certain things are being chosen over others. And those are those numbers. And then in the same sense, since we're focusing both on carbon neutrality and housing production, the takeaways for carbon emissions are telling us that, of course, scenario 2 would result in the best situation for carbon reduction. We would end up even just by right and affordable housing incentive projects would have 30 to 40% fewer emissions there. And that jumps up to 60% fewer emissions on sustainable incentive projects. And so that's obviously really like reduced and less emphasized in scenario 1 and 3. Okay, so it is almost exactly 2 o'clock, 1:59. We have 1 hour to get through 7 questions. The first of which is this: which outcomes are preferred to address our housing and climate outcomes together? Any kind of broad feedback you guys have on that? It is like, at the end of the day, it is like a fairly simplistic answer that is helpful to us. And then there's a follow-up question of, we want to make sure we have the space of, identifying any particular zoning districts that should be excluded or treated differently as we move forward. So there's 6 other questions. Do we want to start with this one first? See what everybody has to say?
Knowing what the other questions are, it's hard to know.
Okay.
But have you guys prioritized staff? Like, if we don't get to question number 7, are these in the orders of what you want us to answer? Most helpful to least helpful?
No, not necessarily. I can.
Really important. But I think getting the feedback from the scenarios is probably the most important, because that really kind of tells us where people are at and where they really want us to do that stuff. So things like that information, we kind of understand where the film is.
So this friend would be number 1. Okay, then let's start here. So I believe it's time to open it up to commissioners. I know Commissioner Denham has his hand raised.
I do want to say, feel free to call on me last, because I'm always going to have feedback and I don't want to
knew that. Yeah, so that's why I was just gonna offer it up to anyone else first, not to exclude you, but because I know we can count on you. Anyone else have thoughts? Feedback on answering the first question: which outcomes are preferred to address climate and outcomes together? So which scenario?
I'm always for scenario 3. More production. We have 2 months of absorption rate. I mean, we stopped selling houses. We have 2 months of inventory. But we need inventory.
I'm always gonna be about inventory.
Yep.
And 30.
Kind of look for the commissioners in the room or online.
I'm checking the chat.
Yeah, well, and more inventory brings prices down.
Right.
Yes, it's competition, then there's more supply. So then you don't have everybody trying to fight for the same number of units. You actually may have a lot of vacant units, which drives prices down.
Okay.
Sure.
So I would argue a counterpoint from that perspective. I don't necessarily agree that scenario 3 has a high 10-year housing plan impact. I think it's moderate. I agree it has a high housing impact on production, but I don't know that my personal impact is based on just the number of units, but who's benefiting from those units. And number 3 doesn't have any consideration for that. So if we build 90,000 units under scenario 3, and they're all vacation rentals, that doesn't help us. And if we give developers everything by right, there is no required tie-in to housing that benefits our workforce, low-income owner occupants, or the folks that I'd like to see benefited by increased inventory. So I do recognize the housing plan has a goal of just number of units is increased, like a supply is a thing. And so that's why I would say it's a moderate impact there, because it does meet one goal, but it doesn't target anything to folks that I would like to see helped by any work that we do as a community to incentivize or create housing units for folks that live and work here, or folks that are lower income, or folks that are struggling. And so I just want to be cognizant of that. Like, I don't know that it necessarily is high to me. And I do understand it does half of what we want it to do, but I just don't think it does all of it. And so just based on green and red and whatever, my impact, my advocacy is always going to be for units, more units that are directed or available or affordable to those we are most likely trying to serve. So I just put that out there.
And that's correct. We identified that scenario 3 has a low impact on income restricted units. It's very clear. And if we proceeded down the path of like, let's see how we can ramp up housing production dramatically, we cannot forget the affordable housing incentives and how to perfect and calibrate and make those and take another, like a really hard look at how those incentives are still functioning as incentives. If we give too much away with parking, density bonus here, there, everywhere, everybody gets density bonus, then how does that impact our affordable housing incentives? So it certainly doesn't get dropped at all. It was just interesting hearing from the consultant when I was concerned about like, what are you saying? What are you suggesting for affordable housing incentives themselves? And they kind of pulled back and said, we're really just trying to understand where everybody can land on these base code issues. And then that once those are perfected and kind of calibrated correctly in a way that everybody's comfortable with, then take a look at our incentive programs and ensure that those are actually attractive still to developers. Or are there any other new ideas where we can bring in, like, are the incentives changing in any way? And we're just not there yet because we're just trying to figure out directions and a path forward for base code requirements.
They kind of hear like if we like a strong support, but with kind of some caveats maybe to scenario 3 and but like kind of without hearing what we feel, so like you two are looking to say something that kind of if we do start to explore that understanding maybe kind of like another scenario that we somehow incorporate some of the incentives or benefit student incentives. But
I just don't want to give everything away. And then what gets built isn't benefiting who we hoped it would, right? Like more units, yes, is one tool and it needs to happen. It's just, did we get the units to benefit the people who want
Yeah.
to. So I just throw that out as a philosophical conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, if you incentivize, could you just incentivize at a cap size of a home? Because we don't need any more 24,100 square foot homes, like incentivize up to because we want the 1,600 and we want the 1,800 site. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's going to drive the price of the home as well. I mean, by no
And
means
there's-
do I want more acre parcels with.
And there's a
We
big
don't need-
difference between, and Tiffany and I, we've just like learned this over time. It's just like, there's a difference between an ownership unit and a rental, like a large multifamily development, how it looks, how the costs associated, how it becomes affordable to the end user, what's appealing to the developer in delivering that project. Totally different set of kind of rules and outcomes when you're looking at like a subdivision. So of course, all of those things need to be really delved deep, especially in particular with the incentives going forward. So that we're figuring out how to actually incentivize both ownership and rental, or is it even feasible to, I think that's a fair question. How is it feasible to incentivize a below market ownership unit on a single family lot?
Well, but maybe it's
Yeah,
not, like you
right.
just painted yourself into a corner, like you said, single family lot owner, like it
Right.
could be a condo.
Sure, because we're gonna have,
Like there's, and we're not gonna get into every developer specific
Mhm.
forma, but like, that's a good thing. Can we incentivize smaller units or required with the zoning code that they're smaller units? Or
Mhm.
smaller lot sizes, like minimum lot sizes, so you don't have to have a 10,000 square foot lot. You only need a
Mhm.
5,000 square foot lot, and maybe that's where FAR comes in, I don't know, but like,
Mhm.
can we incentivize to get what we want, which if we're saying out loud, we all agree smaller units
Mhm.
would be beneficial, how do we get smaller units given lot coverage ratios or minimum lot sizes or the widths of the street or the parking requirement, or the resource protection overlay, or the, oh my God, everything.
All of it.
Right,
Yeah.
but to be clear, that's what we're trying to do is incentivize this for folks that are in our community. How do we get the developers to do that with the restrictions that are in place, with the zoning codes that are, and maybe the answer is we can't, I don't know.
No, I mean, so zoning is just a tool,
Right.
right? But we can always move the mark closer. What I think we need to hear though is those overarching goals, right? Like you saw the big high level goals. The big high level goals are, we want this many housing units and we want this, at least 10% of them to come in as affordable, right? There's a ways to accomplish it all, but of that housing production, it sounds like, we want to, what we've been hearing lately is that we want to achieve smaller dwelling unit sizes, and what can we do? Now, we've done some incentive things that, they don't have enough tied to them really to do. And our code already has a ton of creativity built into it to allow all kinds of different things. But I think if we could just hear, like, even if you don't have the finite answer, but it's, of our for sale units, we want to see you achieve smaller units because we think that would dramatically impact the market rate cost. As well as, and there's other things that, like, the big incentives so far for affordable housing have been resources, have been density and parking. And so, but are there other things that now we can utilize to incentivize affordable housing in a different way, but still allow those in our base, right? So don't feel like it's this or it's nothing, if it's endless. If your feeling is, I really want this and this, then say it and we'll see what we can come back and accomplish.
Well, and also, I don't know how far you can take this, but right of refusal for primary homeowners versus, because we do those small homes and you're gonna get investors want to buy them, right?
Mm.
So you have to give first right of refusal to the primary residence. I don't know how you can do that. It's private property rights, I guess you can.
So we also have to do things like that.
It'd be easy though, wouldn't
Well,
it?
I mean, sometimes when we're working on a rezoning, a developer will come in and commit to things like, we won't do short-term rentals, or we'll do first right of refusal. But it's only gonna be in those cases where they're asking for something above and beyond.
Okay.
I'm gonna move to the question number 2.
Oh, wait,
Oh,
I'm sorry. Anyone else have comments on this? I know Tyler does, so, but I'm guessing, I'm assuming, because, yeah, perfect. Okay. I didn't want to move on without you. And then I also didn't know if like Haley has anything online.
I'm not seeing anybody from online.
Okay.
Commissioners.
Okay, Tyler, you want to?
Yeah, I
Yes.
just want to make the point that when you're trying to construct a scenario to move forward with, because the ultimate scenario you end up with will probably be like a combination of existing ones. My preference would be that you focus on improving by right development because that's how the majority of construction will occur. I think the report itself notes this. In one of the sections, section 2.4.1, it notes that even the scenario that focuses most heavily on the incentive programs, 60% of development still occurs by right. So we're just not going to make much progress if we don't fix up how the majority of housing is built. And when I say improve, I'm thinking things like not just the number of units, but also the type of housing that's being built. Yeah, I'll keep it quick.
Yeah, perfect. I want to ask about the second question on this slide. Are there any zoning districts that should be excluded or treated differently?
Before we move on, there's a comment from Vivi in the chat. I'm okay for now, thank you. Although I do agree smaller units would be better to benefit the community.
Cool. Thank you, Haley. I'm sorry. I know it's hot, but
I know you guys were in front of them.
Yeah, so I have a thought about this for zoning districts and it's not, it's adjacent. I'm wondering if we can create an overlay. I know you love those, but that is more tied to transit oriented design. So we can get maybe higher densities or maybe less parking or maybe like, so we're incentivizing higher density development near public transportation or whatever. I find that that'll help meet both goals, sustainability and housing goals. I know we found it to be beneficial in our lower income housing units. We don't see a lot of people or fewer people with vehicles, but now they're tied to transportation, which is truly important. At the state level, I know for Life Act, et cetera, they're incentivizing transit oriented design, have for years. I just feel like that might be a zoning overlay that should be considered.
That's actually our next question.
Oh,
Density. Sorry. Yeah. No,
looked ahead. No, I didn't. So, okay.
no, it's great.
Anyone else on this one? Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Is this right? Okay, yeah. Yeah, so the first question has to do with where do we want to see more density? Should we focus density increases in areas where people are already driving less to achieve more walkability and less emissions? That kind of those considerations. And I think your comment like really hits on that.
I don't know if you all agree with that. Sorry, that was just my 2 cents. So.
I don't think we should limit it to just those areas though.
No, but just if you're looking for where do we want it, the extra frosting on top of like, we're gonna, as opposed to like trying to redevelop way out on the outskirts of town for whatever, to me, it makes sense for sustainability goals as far as like fewer trips and honestly, just convenience for folks who can't afford a vehicle, quite frankly. It makes sense to put these higher density developments more infill, closer to existing or future public transport.
You can also have the added benefit of those speaking with where we're going to serve like public infrastructure. We do see some of those.
Right.
I'll just add.
Oh,
Yeah, go
oh, Haley, you want to go ahead?
I was basically just gonna to echo what you were saying, and you know, people in outlying areas are perhaps, you know, driving into town for work or struggling with transportation to work. So having higher population or higher density in areas where there are more jobs is important as well. So that's it.
Thank you. Heather, you had yours.
Yeah, a slightly different version of that comment. I would prefer that the incentive programs focus on density allowances versus other ways in which they try and do value capture, particularly parking. I'll talk about parking more later, but I think it's much better to use density as a form of value capture instead of things like parking.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Okay. So yeah, we're kind of shifting gears for this, like the second kind of subset of this density topic.
do we want to increase density allowances for all new development? Or kind of only award a density bonus to a project that's delivering affordable units?
That's actually what my comment
Yeah.
was in reference to, out ahead of us.
Yeah, we want to increase density allowances for affordable housing projects. So income restricted or all market rate housing, any development.
I personally think all market rate housing because the home prices are not gonna stop going up. And
Wages aren't getting.
wages, they don't always follow, like you said. To just limit it to people with, a certain area median income, I think there's people who aren't even within those area median incomes that can't afford house that live here. They make good money. So I think you then shut out, I guess, that middle housing piece of it.
Okay.
I mean, I have lots of people that have great jobs and make great incomes,
Mhm.
but still can't buy a house. But they don't qualify for the down payment assistance or this or that, or.
I want to see some way that we can massively incentivize developers to build something besides a house that's $800 or $800 base price.
Yeah.
We have, why would a developer come to Flagstaff and build a $400,000 house?
When was that where
There's absolutely no. And I mean, unless they're very, so what I'm looking, charitable.
or altruistic?
Yeah, I mean, unless it's somebody that's, going to do it out of the goodness of their heart, there is no incentive to build even a $500,000 home. I mean, you can get a condo now for $500,000-600,000.
Yeah, the problem is the land costs so much.
But if you did it on a bigger scale, I mean, I have some ideas, but it would take massive zoning allowances. Like, I think we need another Railroad Springs.
That's where I am. I'm the HOA president of Railroad Springs. And that area is really good for people to get into as an initial house. I mean, we don't have big lots. We have moderate sized homes. And one of the big problems that we have is density of the condos in front of them. We have nothing but a problem with parking them. And I want you guys to understand, snow removal there is pathetic. We have people parked on the street. Where do they put these cars? When we talk about cutting down the number of parking spaces per unit, guess who gets to rent those? Is the NAU students, and they need a car, each and every one of them, to get to school from that location. So we have to keep all that in mind when we start putting restrictions on parking. Oh, we'll give you this much if you only put this many cars there. That doesn't work. And we've seen it with, what was it, the Hub? All those places. I work at the O'Reilly down there, and we have kids parking everywhere because there aren't adequate parking spots, and no, they can't walk that far. So we have to look at all of that to find an affordable housing package that's gonna work.
If I can respond to that, I think a different framing of that. I agree that there is an issue with parking in those areas, but I believe the issue is that the street parking is unregulated. So these students are able to use the street as long-term car storage because they're incentivized to do so. There's no fee associated
Not
with
during the
it.
winter, but the fee part there, we can't do it in Railroad Springs because they're public streets. We blocked all of our residents from parking there by the HOA regulations, but that's illegal, so we can't enforce it. So we have all kinds of things. And when you're also talking about narrowing the streets, I spent 23 years with the fire department. Driving a narrow street with a fire truck in an emergency is unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. There's many communities on that side of town that have the narrowed streets. And when you go in there, if you're going there for a fire or medical emergency and people are parked illegally, which is 99% of the time, you're having a difficult time negotiating that truck through this. I was the guy, I was the engineer. So I know what it is to drive through those areas and you're losing public safety by narrowing the streets even a little bit.
Right,
I
though,
will push it back on,
just in terms of the Railroad Springs townhomes, they are different and unique. That is not a development pattern you can replicate today because they are like 4-bedroom townhomes and they don't have driveways. They only have a garage, so they need their 2 parking spaces only with garages. We know what happens with garages, except if you live at my house. But so we know and we understand with garages, and I've lived in a community too where people were actually living in the garage, but hey, we all do what we can to live in Flagstaff. I get it. Those streets, in addition, so not only are there not driveways and only the garages, those streets are really incredibly narrow. So you have like the whole combination.
You do.
That's one of the reasons why we don't do today what we do, but we went so far in opposite direction. So when we talk about street widths, know that there are neat like variations in the conversation. To date, we've gone with maybe the most extreme street width. So we definitely hear you and the concerns of the fire department as well, and they're engaged in that conversation with us. But there is definitely work to be done because when you try to create smaller lots with smaller houses, but your road is just astronomically huge, it is sort of a counterintuitive situation, right? And then we add resources on top of it. But I just want to point out, it doesn't have to be the situation that's in Railroad Springs. If that's something we don't like, there still are other alternatives. So
Yeah, I just had to bring that up.
yeah, no, I
Driving through
We
the
hear
the fire truck is pathetic.
I know it's definitely one of the.
It's
the
challenging. It's-
I would push back a little bit though of framing it as a public safety issue because there's a lot of research that shows that wider residential streets are actually more dangerous because they lead to higher speeds of through traffic, and then speed is directly and highly correlated with rate of injuries and the severity of those injuries.
Where were 100 of those roundabouts?
But what I'm referring to is when the call comes up and we have to get to your house.
National statistics
Sometimes
do
we
show
can't
though
put
that like 95% of those calls are actually for things like traffic accidents, in fact, not fire-related incidents. But I do agree with you that we need to be able to get those trucks to those areas quickly. And I think one thing to consider there is just having smaller, more maneuverable equipment. There's probably a compromise position where you could allow developments to utilize a narrower street option. But then if they opt into that, you charge an impact fee that can go towards the purchase of smaller, more maneuverable equipment. I've looked at the studies on the land costs associated with these extra wide street widths, and it's thousands and thousands of dollars per lot. There's probably a lot of leeway to charge an impact fee that will be able to purchase smaller, more maneuverable equipment and, still allows developers to get those nicer, smaller streets.
You guys, I'm gonna jump in here. We have 35 minutes to get through 5 more questions. Do we feel like do we have any other comments about how to distribute density, or should we be moving on to the narrower streets question? Okay, all right. Okay, so the next question was kind of getting at Jackie, your comment from a few minutes ago about how do we get a $400,000 house? And this is where that FAR conversation starts to come in. Like there is potential for us to explore this. Like we can have the consultants like pursue this idea if we were to. Yeah, did I get on the right thing? Okay, yeah. So yeah, just as a question for the group, do you guys support including FAR in, to attempt to regulate those residential uses and hopefully result in some smaller footprints? Is that because like I think Genevieve said on one of the slides, they're currently FAR standards are only currently in commercial zones. So do we want to use that concept of trying to squeeze unit sizes a little smaller in our residential zones?
That's a good question. So I understand the basic premise of like one whole unit on one floor versus like half of it on the second floor. It feels like an assumption though to think if there's 2 stories that are half as big as the 1 story for the whole thing, that's 2 units.
Yeah,
It is.
she was just, it was just an easier way to explain, but think of it as, you have a 3,000 square foot lot, and your FAR is 50%, you can build a 1,500 square foot house.
Right, but you're going up, but does that assume that every, like,
That's not necessarily going up. You could build single level 1,500, you could build that 1,500 is 2 stories, you're not gonna go above 2 stories with 1,500. You're liable not to go 2 stories with 1,500.
I just don't understand how it gets you more units. It gets you higher height or
It
lower.
gets you smaller units.
So they have to be smaller units under FAR.
The developer wants to put as many units as possible into the building envelope. But at the moment, the allowed density can't get you to the number of units they would want to put in that building envelope. So instead, they're shrinking the building envelope so that the units they do put in are smaller. Ours basically like the building volume in a way.
Right, I mean, it just presupposes that instead of one large one, each of the floors is a separate unit, and I just don't understand.
It's
that.
There's not enough space to go out. Right? You can approach it on the next.
Right.
So you're just trying to small units going there.
It's not necessarily, so you have to, okay, single family is so much different than multifamily, okay? Single family, if you think about it, you've got a 3,000 square foot lot, it's gonna allow a 1,500 square foot home.
Okay.
Okay, it's just a cap, you're not gonna build bigger than a 1,500 square foot home. The issue becomes whether or not you include the garage in. You go to multifamily, FAR does something a little bit different, right? So the developer has a mix. They're going to create all different sizes of units, right? When you look at a large apartment complex, that FAR is going to look and feel a lot different. You're probably going to have a much higher FAR than you would on the R1 zone, right? So the key is that we have all of the tools right now in the toolbox for developers to create small lots. But there's nothing that prohibits them from, once they build a 3,000 square foot lot, from putting a 5,000 square foot home on it.
Right.
It's especially because they can go up. So if they just use lot coverage, they can build these big houses. And that's ultimately what we're seeing in the single family market, is even when we create small lots, we're still getting the bigger houses, right? Because bigger houses do generally sell more. So the heart of the feedback is in the single family home market, can we come to a tool? The offset to that, though, if you do put the FAR on the smaller lots, is you might have a developer at the end of the day that decides it's still better off for them to do the bigger lots with the bigger houses. Right? There's just absolutely no guarantee either way around. There will always be a way for a developer to bring something different to the market because the options are there. So it is a tool. It's a positive tool in the right direction, but they could also commit to less lots, bigger lots, still bigger homes, because the money they would make off that project is bigger, right? So depending upon where the market is at any given time. I know when Pine Canyon Homes, like when Pine Canyon sold out, I was like, wow, right? It only took 20 years. Because the market wasn't always there for the $1 million homes that are now our regular homes.
And the $5 million homes.
Yeah.
The only thing I'll add to the FAR discussion is a recap of my earlier comments. I'm not opposed to FAR per se, but I'm opposed to layering on an additional level of building standard without an overall simplification. Because I think our code right now is very complex. The average resident can't really understand it, and that's ultimately an equity issue. A simpler set of building standards would be better.
I think when you're bored, you should read the land development code. Okay, so
Haley, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you very much. So just as somebody who works for a developer and a redeveloper, I mean, at the end of the day, you kind of touched on this, but they're really just concerned about their bottom line and how much money they're going to make. So, like the thing about it is I don't think the 1,500 square foot homes are getting built because they're not going to generate a large bottom line for these developers. So I think in this discussion, it's important to remember that, if we want the developers to do something, they have to be financially incentivized to do something for right or for wrong, because they're not going to do it unless it makes sense for them financially to do it. So I would say if we think, you know, the floor area ratio caps helps get that done, you know, perhaps it's a good idea, but it's just kind of, it's a really delicate balance between putting up too many barriers to development and then, you know, and then basically not having enough. This is a very interesting conversation, but anyways, I just wanted to say that as somebody who's worked for a developer for a long time, you know, they just won't, if they're going to run a pro forma, they're going to run a unit mix analysis, they're going to run all of the things that they can run, or they're going to see if they could make more money building big houses versus small houses, and whichever makes more money and pays their money back faster is going to be what they choose. So just, I don't know if the consultant can, you know, figure that into their analysis at all, but it's just another important piece of this puzzle. So that's all.
Thanks, Aileen.
Yeah, and the consultants do have like a pro forma, like a rate of return analysis that they've done that's really, that they can continue to do as we keep refining. So they can kind of look at those.
How much are they, and I should know, how much are they figuring in for market? Because, I mean, even if we reduce the zoning code to the point where someone could build a home for $150,000, but if the market says you can sell that home for 800,000, what are they
Why
gonna
would
do?
they sell it for?
I think,
I mean, the first one might sell for 800,000, but what will the 2000th one sell for?
well, and it's not even the 2000 one, they're making this as Timber Sky's probably a great example. I think,
Mhm.
you know, a lot of those did go at, you know, a decent, like a fair margin above what they were built them for, but it's the resale. It's the resale, and so, I don't want to add more complexity to this, but if they're ready to have feedback on that, we can consider their eligibility as well. I think that's where I personally struggle with understanding how much control, like, where we have leverage for that. It's-
And I think one thing I'll just add is, you know, again, where we are in the project, we're looking for large direction, right? And so the idea in the scenario 2, where they looked at FAR, was also increasing density. So if we did move forward with FAR, or the consultant looking at it, they would look at it in relation to increased density or reduced parking. So it would be calibrated. So I think it's not an island, like all of these things fit together. So if it seems like a good tool that you might want to potentially explore, that's what kind of the feedback we're looking for is.
Like
Do
a yes
we
or no?
explore this
Mhm.
as a potential tool to help get those smaller unit sizes that everyone has been asking for. And then you look at that in relation to density and calibrate it so that it works. So it's not by itself and it's not causing problems.
It's actually achieving what we were hoping it to.
Yeah.
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 So yeah, if anybody has any other comments on FAR, I can move to the next topic, which is parking.
That sounds like it'll be fun.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So remember, a major finding of the report is that we can't make much progress on our greater housing production numbers without some sort of reduction to parking. So again, sort of a simplistic question. Do you support in general the idea of moving forward with parking reductions? And then there's some really important follow-up questions we have that are listed there. So who wants to start? Commissioner Keller?
You want to go ahead?
As a property manager, and given the price of homes in Flagstaff, I can tell you that there are 4, 5, 6 people per property.
Mhm.
As long as the house is big enough, you know, you can allow 2 per bedroom. The biggest areas of concern are some of the newer, high density, let's say South Side, the Brandon Homes area,
Mhm.
like Fontaine and Ellery and in there.
House.
What is parking like down there?
I don't use my parking.
Well, I know
rented to
you
a
don't. What is
NACC.
parking in the area like?
Oh, it's uncontrolled. So you get quite a bit of street parking on the side
It's
streets.
funny that you have parking in people's yards. I know because I'm the one that gets phone calls. I think increasing density and decreasing parking it's gonna be like another Railroad Springs townhome.
I have people parking in their yard all the time.
I think that's a huge problem.
So then should on-street parking be addressed in conjunction with, if we were to make even smaller reductions in parking, are there other kind of programs that we can look to kind of point to package it together where parking is managed a little bit more stringently in different ways and we utilize streets more than we?
The reality is that there's too many cars per residence.
Correct.
That's the bottom line. People have 1, 2, 3 cars apiece.
Just wait till May, you'll find out.
Oh, I
I have a
know.
question.
The whole town opens up.
Mhm.
I guess I have a question about this, this problem with property management in a rental in a rental situation of any shape or form. Couldn't and don't in other bigger cities, couldn't property managers or landlords charge for parking, like disincentivize their tenants from bringing in the 6 cars? And is that like a strategy I don't know if the report. No, but I mean, that would be something on a private property to address the.
You could write it
problems.
into the lease or, yeah.
Right, and we don't see, I don't know, do we see anything like that in Flagstaff? With leases and. Where it's like you're paying for it, it's like, oh, do you really want that car?
The only ones that is, let's see, an example would be Reardon. Reardon has permits. You can have, depending on how many bedrooms and how many permits you get. And then they have 1 guest pass that they can dole out, so they can have 1 person over at a time if they drive.
Well, and in real homes, there's parking permits that are associated.
Yes, real homes, also, Christmas tree, the St. Nicholas Circle townhomes, they all have parking permits. So you can do it, especially on like a bigger project. But again, if you're gonna do like the single family neighborhoods with higher density, I'm just saying the cost of renting a house here requires multiple, and there's generational housing going on now where multi-generational housing where your parents are living with you, or you have a brother and sister with their spouses and their kids and they're sharing a big house. I would just be really careful with the parking thing.
And I think what we've heard from traffic is that, even if there is managed parking like that, just something to consider. So we can't have that, I think you can't have that managed parking conversation without on-street parking conversation. Because just because the tenant or the landlord is only selling 2 permits, doesn't mean that they can't still have 4 cars. It just means 2 of those cars get parked someplace else. So it's potentially distributing the issue. So I think those 2 conversations have to go hand in hand. They're worth the conversation, but they have to be, it's nuanced.
Yeah.
And I did see a hand online.
Yeah. Haley, do you want to go?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on this topic because, I mean, like, as we're talking about this, I mean, parking, basically my original comment was going to be, should parking be left to the developer or the market to decide, or should there be standards? There should, I mean, in my opinion, there should be standards. And then if there are standards, then landlords would be forced to write some sort of parking into their leases. And if landlords have additional parking income, that's going to look good for them as part of their net operating income, which is going to increase the value of their investment. So, I mean, from that perspective, I think it would be good. I agree that, yeah, if there's 2 cars permitted and 2 cars go park everywhere else, that would be an issue. But I think just from a perspective of, standards, then writing it into leases, then charging for parking, that could actually be good for developers. So.
Thank you, Haley. Yes, question or comment?
Hi, folks. Jenny Neiman, Climate Action Section Director here with the team supporting the project. I just want to mention that I think this really relates to the conversation that was brought up about where do we put our density, right? Where do we have these conversations? Because, it costs $35,000 or more to build a structured parking space, right? And so when we think about the reason this is here and on the table is because it's an affordability issue, particularly when you think about, even if you're at single family housing and how, I've seen the calculations on a duplex before, and you have to have 4 parking spaces by the end of the day on a small duplex, right? And so this is really about affordability, but it is also about where we align with just helping folks not rely on that car. I think to Commissioner Gobby's point of like, we need people to have less cars. And so this really aligns with the permanent transit network, right? And thinking about TOD standards that say, we are going to push this density to this place so that we can do this. And that when people can uncouple, it's called uncoupling, and you uncouple the rent from your parking spot. So you can rent a parking spot without having to pay for you can rent an apartment without having to pay for the parking spot if you're not doing it, and can really increase affordability in town. So just want to throw that out there in its relationship to the transit conversation.
Awesome. Yeah.
And I think just to add on to that, I believe a service parking space in a multifamily or other development is $3,000 to $5,000 per space. So that also adds to the cost of construction.
Yeah, I'd like to reframe some of these concerns about reducing parking or less parking in new developments. The issue you're describing, which is very real, is you have all these people that are using street parking or free public parking for car storage because there's not enough parking on site. I would reframe that. That's not an issue of inadequate parking on site. That is an issue of the public and the street parking being unregulated and free. This is exactly the logic that led to the implementation of Park Flag, the parking benefit district downtown. When you could park downtown for free for as long as you wanted, you had all of these students that used it as free car storage because why not? It's free money, basically. Otherwise, you have to pay a ton of money for that. So the negative externality we're talking about here is best managed directly through a parking benefit district and there are lots of ways to set those up, but the basic way is you give out a permit to residents, and there are different ways to allocate them. Some places like every house gets 1 permit, which sort of benefits homeowners implicitly. Or it might be that you auction off permits or you have a set price for permits or something. There are lots of different ways to do it. But basically you give residents a right to park on the street. And then there may be a few other places on each block that are open that if there's high enough demand, you can actually meter and then collect revenue from that. And that revenue can be used for neighborhood improvements. And that's in planning, that's the better way of managing that externality. And along that line, my suggestion, I'm actually not satisfied with the approach towards parking and the current draft report. I encourage you to add as an option the elimination of parking minimums and a pivot to the regulation of on-street parking instead. I can get into the details, but parking minimums are an outdated planning tool and shown to be ineffective because it's not directly addressing the negative externality. The values are arbitrary and they carry a lot of negative externalities. I mean, they greatly inflate the cost of housing, but there's also a lot of sustainability impacts. They inflate the amount of paved surfaces, which increases urban flooding and the heat island effect, and it increases transportation emissions by pushing residents and destinations apart. I would say the potential elimination of parking minimums and the pivot to management of on-street parking is one of the highest, if not the highest impact policy we're considering here. And I say that after like 4 years of talking to tons of experts in this area and my own research. And yeah, and I will note that this isn't like a radical thing. There's about 14 million Americans across 88 cities in the US that already live without parking minimums, and we've got lots of research on what happens. It's not like chaos. In fact, it's actually an incremental policy. It takes years. Like we have good studies on the larger cities that have done this already, like Buffalo and Seattle and whatnot. And it takes years for developments to start utilizing lower parking ratios because it's really hard to get financing. Banks are hesitant to lend to projects that aren't adequately parked. And in suburban developments, you really don't see any reduction at all. suburban developments, they're absolutely dependent on cars. They willingly choose to build the same or if not more parking. And I'll also say, so the report has this assumption that we should sort of keep parking as a value capture, a form of value capture, basically. We impose parking minimum so that we can trade them away in exchange for affordable units or other things. I disagree with that approach because right-sizing parking in and of itself is an affordability and a sustainability. It helps both of those. So like the city wants developers to right-size parking. Developers want to right-size parking. Why should we use that as a negotiation tool? And a last point, I know I'm talking a lot, I'm sorry. I want to note that eliminating parking minimums isn't even the maximalist position from a sustainability perspective. If you're trying to prioritize sustainability perspectives, you would actually go ahead and impose maximums and then charge things like impact fees according to the amount of paved surfaces to account for those negative externalities. So like we're not even on that end of possibilities. And just one more point, sorry. I would like to say out of those 88 cities that have already gotten rid of parking minimums, that's actually 2 of the 4 cities that are listed in the report as peer cities. So Duluth, Minnesota, and South Bend, Indiana are both studied in the report as peer cities. Those cities don't have parking minimums. I think Duluth actually imposes parking maximums. Rant over. Thank you for your time.
Has a comment.
Yeah, I just had a quick comment. I mean, I think that there is probably some middle ground between if part of the goal is actually to reduce the number of cars, then if there are parking standards, could the city, like if a developer reduces parking or charges for parking, could the city give X amount of transportation passes, and then that could be some sort of marketing incentive for a developer. Like if you are one of the first people to lease this, you get a parking pass or not a parking pass, like a transportation pass, because I think like you have to look at it holistically. Like if the goal is affordability, that's one thing. If the goal is to reduce cars, that's kind of another thing. So I don't know. I just feel like I understand how the goals are married together, but like, I don't think they can be solved by exactly the same thing. So you have to find some sort of middle ground.
Just to let you know, the city actually already does have offered that type of a program. It is actually tied to the high occupancy housing. And it's not that the city gives them away, it's that the developer can purchase those passes and give them to their tenants. So we do have something like that handy.
Yeah. Do they have any sort of like discount? I mean, I'm just thinking from a developer's perspective, like they're probably not going to do that unless there's some incentive for them to do it. So
I think it's the reduced parking.
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't have to pay 35,000 for the parking space to create, so they're gonna do the parking. We have how many more questions?
We have 1, 2, 3
And we have 15.
and 11 minutes. What do we want to do? We have winter parking ordinance as a topic, reduce street widths as a topic, and then the question of the menu of sustainability options is the next question. And I just wanted to acknowledge that Haley's question about transportation demand with the bus passes is kind of tied to this next question.
I think we've heard a lot through just this conversation about winter parking and street widths.
And we can just run with that. And we have 10 minutes, the luxury of 10 minutes to talk about these topics. Like,
Let's just dive into it.
yeah.
Get a count of, I see a lot of members of the public both online and here. Is there anybody specifically here to give public comment for this item?
Good thinking. I did
Love it. I think there was one online, so we can leave like 3 minutes for her.
Do you want to do that now before we go on to menu of sustainability options, or do this one?
Do you want to hear this?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Did you want to provide public comment now for 3 minutes?
Who are you talking to?
And I was just wondering if you wanted to give your public comment now, or if you were just
Yeah.
here to listen.
Well, I
Okay,
put
you'll-
the questions on the chat. I put the questions on the chat, so you know you're aware of my questions. If you want to answer them now, that's fine. Otherwise, you can move on.
What are they related to?
One was for the FAR. Do cathedral ceilings count as one floor or two? Because they're taking up, you know, the second level doesn't really count because it's just air, it's not floor, so it's not increasing housing use. And the other question was, boy. Oh, can we stipulate that HOAs require forbidding short-term rentals? Because that is something that they have the option of doing according to state law. And I was wondering if we can make that mandatory for any that, new developments.
My understanding is no. And, okay, we're getting, affirmation that this, you can't require HOAs to limit, that kind of usage. They have the option of doing it, but we can't require it.
And then
Okay.
the first question is FAR, if it's one floor, then it's just one floor, even if it has a cathedral. So it's not double.
No, but I've seen houses with cathedral ceilings that take up, the half of the second floor exists and the other half is just the ceiling from the ground floor.
So if there's a loft, then it's two floors, and then the floors would be. Yeah. There's a loft, but if it's just.
If it's just a high ceiling, then no. But if there's living space on the second floor, then yes.
Does anybody want to kick us off on this topic of support for a menu of sustainable requirements or design standards?
So can I just clarify, if there is a menu, then is there a point minimum? Is this a requirement? Then they have to get to 10 points and there's 6 different options?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So
if
it would be
we're
required.
Yeah, and that was like my beginning here, then the options are typically rated, like the things you really want to encourage, you give more points to,
Mhm.
so that you're really trying to get the design focused.
My only feedback is, I said this earlier, but I would add unbundling parking from rent as, honestly, you could add it as both an affordable housing and a sustainability incentive. Be framed either way or both ways.
And to me, I guess the devil's in the details. Right? Like, I mean, if it's 50 points of sustainability and the only way you can get there is with really high cost upfront, requirements, then probably not, because we don't increase the housing costs so much. But if it's things like bicycle facilities or site design, or it's passive solar or southern, I guess it's just like, what does it really mean when we get to the cost?
So that's the feedback.
Yeah, it could be good, it could be bad. You don't want to put up too many barriers to make it too unaffordable for a developer to develop.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then that tells us that you want us to explore it, that you have to balance and what you achieve and not at the expense of.
Yeah.
When commissioners are done, Councilmember House would like to make a comment.
Okay, so then,
There's time.
sure. So before moving on to Councilmember House, any other?
I just have one thing to say that we talked about as our group. We talked about a net zero where if a sustainability requirement is imposed, there should be something on the other side of it, brings up the cost. And something should be changed on the other side to bring down the cost on the affordability side. So if you're gonna require, I don't know, all gas or all electric appliances or all electric heating, whatever, and it increases the cost over here, you should do something that decreases the cost on the affordability side. That makes sense?
There's no net impact.
Mhm.
The net zero.
And that speaks to exactly what we're trying to do here,
Mhm.
right? Make sure we're balancing that, make sure we're walking together with this conversation with what that looks like for the developers at the end of the day.
And it also gets to, I mean, we want to do it because it's the right thing to do, but it also helps us get through that, navigate that Proposition 207 and not getting those waivers. So we would, incentivize them for two different reasons.
Yeah, I think one last thing just to think about is the long-term operating costs of the house too. Like say
Yeah.
you have a little more insulation, but it creates a ton over time and energy bills. I experienced that with my house. And so I think back to Lana's point about just the cost of different things, they don't all cost the same, and maybe some have a bigger impact on long-term operation costs than others. We're kind of like looking at that as well as how they all fit together. But it's just something that to think about, the long-term operation.
Yeah.
How some of these features might impact that.
How does it?
Haley, do you have anything else to say there?
I don't know. I agree.
And then do we have Councilmember House who wants to make a comment?
Mine is just a general comment, so I can wait for you guys to get through the rest of the questions that are here for you.
Thank you. So do we have enough time to do the one more, or are we good? Because we've already basically giving you direction about street widths and.
I think the parking ordinance in the street list was okay. Do we have any particular thoughts on including transportation demand management strategies as part of that menu? If parking reductions are pursued and kind of packaging those TDM options like bicycle facilities, the transit passes, car sharing programs. It's so that those would be options the developer could choose to achieve the points.
Yeah.
The transit oriented, this
Yeah.
is something that you are,
Mhm.
you are aware of.
I mean, I don't see any reason why not, but I'm also
Yeah.
not like the sustainability focus where it's like, we know we need to look at these 5 things, and if we muddy the waters with these 7 other things. But I would think this does go to your transit oriented benefit.
And these to me are like the kind of the best options as far as achieving both the housing affordability and the sustainability. I mean, the goals. This is almost like low hanging fruit in that category because you are decoupling. That's how we naturally sort of decouple that way and parking.
Yeah.
Or marking.
Yes.
2:59, guys.
All right, so I do want to turn it over to Councilmember House. Yeah,
It's only 2:50.
we've got 5 more minutes. I know we're.
Oh, okay. I have the wrong time.
So Councilmember House, do you want to make your comments now?
Sure, I will try and be very quick. Thank you all for the conversation. I am just very appreciative of all of the thought that you all as commissioners have put into this. I wanted to express appreciation for Councilmember Zaroya's comment about seeking balance and that broader perspective on the actions and impacts that are being presented to you all. I try and avoid being too metaphorical in conversations, but I was an English major, so I can't always help it. And for me, I am really thinking of these policies and impacts as a bowl of water. And if we think about a bowl of water and the impacts on that, if you focus on and blow on just one area of the surface of that water, displacement is going to happen under the surface and ripples are going to happen across the surface. And so I think as we're thinking about what are the best options for us to move forward with these policies, we need to think not only about the impacts of that policy, but how those impacts are going to ripple across everything else that we're talking about. So I appreciate your thoughtfulness in this conversation and the breadth of your focus as you're focusing in on not only the policies and ideas that are being presented to you, but also the broader scope of what those implications might be across not only housing, but sustainability and across the full community impact. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember House. Any final comments from commissioners on this topic?
I would just like to make a recommendation. I don't want to undermine you, but it'd be really nice to hear from builders themselves. I don't know if that's even possible. I mean, we only have really one mass builder here now. But if you have developers that you work with normally,
Yeah.
we could put that on an agenda. I'd love to hear their opinions on what we could do different as a city.
Yeah.
Yeah, to incentivize them to come here and, because I'm seeing more of them leave the community and, so.
And no, I appreciate that. I know it wasn't undermining. I wonder.
Because I know you said you've already implemented their conversations in these.
Well, we
agendas.
we will go back to them if you, but hearing you say you want to hear from.
I want to hear it, yeah.
So my question to you is would that be a good thing to do as part of the town hall conversation, or are you thinking of recording to inform some of that conversation? So we know we're gonna try to have a more robust discussion in June. When we come. And maybe they come there and like, we can start to feed them information, or there could be a iteration before that, really, because I'm happy to work with you.
Like a town hall.
Okay.
And I'll be there. I'd love to hear their side of it too.
Okay. Thanks for that. I think we can figure out how to either do it on the big one or if we have a mini one that leads up to that, but.
Okay, cool.
The other thing I'd like to say is, I think resource protection overlay is missing. Didn't talk about, so.
That's because we're gonna have a big reveal in about a month and a half. We're actually, yeah,
With confetti.
big confetti.
Okay.
Can I do that? That'd be so. This one's disturbing us.
If it's here, then I'll bring a vacuum cleaner.
I was gonna do it right at council.
Oh, that'd be fun too. I won't vacuum council, that'd be weird.
RPO is one of those things that we have to do something sooner. We can't wait for the study and because of it, one is having an impact on housing, but the bigger impact is. And we're going into what I think everybody knows is going to be very scary summer. We actually need to do something quickly and we're figuring. And so just a little bit of a spoiler alert, we're actually going to be taking to council the idea of a pilot program that was kind of others to use some technology, newer technologies that are really kind of put this whole thing on its hands, but really keeping to the community values of why we have that, but then also adding just greater flexibility using prior science. So that we can try to understand what this could look like. And the benefit is that will actually, again, because it's a pilot program, we can put some bookends on it as far as the timing, while we then take what we're finding from that data and what we're seeing, what we're swimming with, and then create code from that. So that's why you're not seeing it with this, is because you need to be cut with that and moves quickly.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Okay, so then we'll cut off that topic. The last items on our agenda are updates. Is it okay to assume we can get those in writing via email?
Yes, and then I also just want to remind commissioners that if you have any item requests or anything of that sort, this isn't just an item on the agenda. This is just something that you can email me at any given time and we can talk about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. It was a long, robust, and interesting meeting. I appreciate your engagement and time, and we will adjourn at exactly 3:00.
Well, it's not.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Well, the city's.